pretty rigid, but a brush has all these hairs that are interacting, acting together to give you this mark, but they can also act independent. So when we slide this way, the brush can kind of open up a little bit, and it's actually thicker here than it is as you head south when the brush starts to come back together. And I can talk about this a little bit, but it's really one of those things that the brush is going to teach you. So there's a little bit of a flare that can start to happen here with a brush that, as you become aware of it, you'll start to cultivate it. And then the other part of this is at the end, when you stop, you can also put a little bit of pressure on and get a slight bit of widening there. So you start to get a natural breathing stroke out of a flat brush. It's one of the big bonuses of it. The other thing that can happen here is that it's not quite manipulation as it is sort of leaning on one corner. In this case, it's the left corner that I'm sort of thinking that I'm drawing the brush off the paper at that spot, and that gives me a little bit sharper edge. It also gives a little bit of illusion that I did some manipulation there. Let me see if we can do one of those without manipulation and get this swelling, receding, and swelling stroke again. So that was all done with pressure and the way I'm dragging the brush off the page. Then this stroke, same brush angle, and I'm thinking about the leading corner of the brush until it hits the vertical stroke. Then I'm putting my attention on the trailing corner of the brush to think about that trailing corner sliding in and creating the silhouette of the counter space. Oops. That one went into the stroke a little bit more than I want to, but this is a case where generally you want to stay away from trying to touch up your flat brush work. But this one I can tell, because I need to get it a little heavier or fill in this space a little bit, I'm going to try a second stroke here. One of the big things about the shaky hand, I hope I'm not sounding like I'm making too many excuses, but it's not so much that the stroke undulates as much as it doesn't end up where you want it to. So really concentrating on getting this silhouette of the inside counter is all that matters. It's that trailing corner of the brush that is creating that shape of the counter. And then you overlap the strokes so that it's all one nice smooth stroke, hopefully. And then down here at the bottom, you just let the brush catch up for a second before you slide to the east. Okay. And now I've got hand lotion with gouache on the end. All right. Between those two marks, we have a huge amount of the letters in the alphabet taken care of. But there's one place in the alphabet that we do want to manipulate a little bit to get this to work, and that is the second stroke, or the last stroke in the V and the W. And you'd think the X, but it's not the X. So with the V, if we keep this same angle, and I really like a flatter angle than a lot of people do, just because I can't stand it when the horizontal stroke of A's and D's is fatter than the vertical strokes. I want the vertical strokes to be the most powerful strokes on the paper. So I'll go for a little bit flatter angle than a lot of traditional calligraphers will go for there. So if we have that angle with the V and we come through, what happens is that second stroke of the V is much heavier than the rest of the letters. And we really need to have this proportion of thick and thin be consistent throughout, or in the same neighborhood at least. So with the V, I found that I can get the look that I want from a manipulation. So you start with the same angle, but right here, when you're changing direction, is the place where you can pivot to a more vertical angle of the brush so that we can approach the thin line that we're getting other places in the letters. So that same thing happens with the W on the last stroke. Let's see. Even here, you know, coming in with a little bit more vertical angle, back to our normal angle for the third stroke, and then the manipulation here. All right. And you'd think that the X, which looks just like the top of the last stroke of the V and the W, would need a manipulation too. But what's happening with the X is that this angle is wider than how steep this one is here. So you really don't need to manipulate because the angle of the brush is going to take you to the thin line. Okay, so lots of other letters are all pulled strokes because they're pulled strokes with a pen to start with. So an S or an R, some of those simpler letters are not going to have the issue where you're pulling a stroke to imitate a pen's pushed stroke. So a lot of things are still the same. But I'd be happy to show you any letters that you might like to see if there are requests.
Can you do an F, please?
An F?
Yes.
Okay. So whether or not you're, you know, the order of strokes, I always find they're like stereo components. You can plug them in at any sequence. So for this, in this case, for that serif, it's really just sliding along the angle. You can see, I keep saying I've got a fixed angle, but here these angles are different a little bit. So it's a variable thing. The brush is so soft that you can make these minute little manipulations without being even aware of them. So you actually probably should be a little bit more aware that I'm taking that angle down here for this stroke. One of the great places in calligraphy with a pen or a brush where you can play around with pen angle that won't have ramifications in other spots in the letter is the crossbars on the T's and the F's. And I really, there just is nothing more ugly to me than a crossbar that is heavier, a horizontal stroke that is heavier than the verticals. And I think that they're even more attractive and increase contrast when your horizontal strokes are nice and thin. So a T and an F have cross strokes that you can flatten out the pen flatter than the angle of the pen or the brush than the normal stroke, and it's not going to give you any trouble. And just to show you places where there is trouble is, so if you have an A, and say we have this flat angle on the brush, one of the dangers of a flat angle is that this stroke can end up being too fat. So if you're starting off with a very flat angle and you think, man, I do not want to have this stroke be too fat, so if I go more vertical, I can avoid that. But what happens is the angles don't match up. So the angles that you choose have ramifications in lots of places where lines have to interact. But these are places where the lines don't have to interact with anything else. So you can flatten out your angle and get a narrower or a slighter crossbar. So in your handouts, you can see the F and the T both have kind of horizontal angles for that, for those horizontal strokes, resulting in thinner strokes. Let's see if I can do it.
Carl, what's your height on those approximate?
Oh, that's my favorite question, Maura.
I think I know. But
You think you know what?
I think I know, but prove.
What is it? What's your guess?
Well, I think it's 4.
Okay. My answer is whatever you want it to be.
Great.
Here's the thing. Have you ever heard that when you're driving in Boston that the traffic signals are just advisory? You know, you can take the advice or not. It's the way people drive there anyway. I feel the same way about the pen nib to height ratio, that when we think about a classic italic, you know, what do we want to say? 4.5, 5 being the classic proportions. And that's just for you to know if you want to have classic proportions. So what I always like to do if I'm paying attention to this, and actually these days, I probably don't even do this. I just start writing and the height of the letter comes out to be what it is, and then you measure it and go from there. So if you did want to study this idea, you could go a tall one, a mama bear, and a baby bear, and decide which proportion feels the most like the job you're about to start on. You know, the project you're about to do, see which one feels the best and say, okay, let's go for the one in the middle. Then I would measure this and draw my guidelines from there. And at that point, you'd find out what your brush width to height ratio is going to be, rather than letting, you know,
The stricture.
some convention tell you what your project is going to look like. I want you to be in charge of all this stuff. We talked last night about this class being about freedom. It's informed freedom, you know, that you want to make the decisions. Hopefully you have a reason for this stuff. And even if the reason is that looks the best, or I like the way that looks, that is a great reason. So then you can measure it, and you'll also have that in the bank of saying, yeah, it turns out that on Saturday, April, what is this, the 17th? It's like 4.25 brush nibs high.
Yeah.
And especially with a brush, it kind of depends on how much pressure you're putting on the brush when you're going to make the checkerboard as to what the exact measurement is. So everything is sort of in the ballpark of what you're working with. But once you draw your guidelines, then your height is established and you don't have to think about that anymore. But my favorite question, because it really does speak to the idea that you're making the decisions about your design, about your the project you're working on. So go ahead and figure it out, because any size can work. Another thing that's a huge part of this is, oops, don't get careless. Oh, good, you didn't see that anyway. That letter never happened. Now I forgot the point I was going to make. It's all right. I am officially elderly at this point, so that'll happen a lot.
Carl, would you mind walking us through the top of that F, that beautiful
Okay.
top of the F?
Well, something happened here before I cover this up. Can you see how, where's my pencil? There it is. See that little dimple right there? I love when that happens. And it's not something I go after. I kind of let it happen. And what happened here was that when I set the brush down, the leading corner made this side of the stroke, but the back corner took a slightly different path than the front, and it went like this. And that's what created that that dimple. One of the tricks for this is if you want to try and get that, you palette it so that the corner is sticking up a little bit. Can you see how that the right corner of the brush is flared out a little bit? So now when I go this way, and as soon as I set it down, it disappeared. So when I'm paletting, I'm leaning on that corner a little bit. But then you have to have a very delicate touch. Yeah, there we go, right there. So that's when this corner of the brush sticks out a little bit, and it makes a different, it takes a slightly different path than the front edge of the brush.
So you try to have the right side of the brush lifting up a little bit?
Yeah,
Okay.
you know, just to get that little dimple there. And it is something that we, one, we're probably going to lose it when we go to pull the stroke to the left, to the right. But it's also something that you could supply when we go to do this stroke, is that yeah. See, this is my main complaint about my shaky hand, is that it's not so much that the hand shakes during the stroke, it's that the hand shakes just as I start to place the brush down, it switches and lands in a different place. So it makes placement a little bit difficult. So if you learn nothing else in this class, it'll be how to make excuses. Anyway, so this simple one, Jill, is to just slide, or you can lift the corner of the, you know, leave the corner down in the direction that you're going. So it's the leading corner you leave down. And so there's a little bit of a lift that will give you a little bit more delicate of a flick lift off of the page. Let's see if we can do a whole letter without getting distracted. And again, I got the tiniest hint of a dimple, and it would mean to cultivate that, I would have to be keeping away from it. So it's actually just one of those things that really only shows up when you are leaving that stroke open. Because really what I'm going to do is fit in here. I kept some of it. And then a flat. And then this is really important for whether you're using a pen or a brush. If you cross a stroke and you can see both corners of the brush when you cross, 9 out of 10 times that stroke is too long. A much classier look for crossing a T or an F, especially an F, is that you touch it so that the right corner of the brush is touching the edge of the stroke, so that all that you're seeing to the left of the stroke is a triangle. There's something like an old-fashioned fence that when you cross and you can see both corners of the brush, it's a little bit too long. If you were in a situation where you wanted a more flowing crossbar on your F or your T, what I suggest in that spot is to slide the brush so that you're not leaving this corner evident. Does that make sense? It's sort of extending the triangle that's sticking out. There's something about seeing two sharp corners on a cross stroke, whether it's with a pen or a brush, that makes that crossbar feel too wide. But if you do want a longer one, just slide it so that you're hiding where that right corner of the brush was before you go to cross the rest of it. Does that make sense? I'm ready to get in arguments with any of you if you'd like. So I like a debate. The thing is actually that if you have a reason for anything, if you know, like if we were going to have a discussion or a debate about why things work or they don't work, if you have a reason for something, that is a good enough reason to go ahead and do it. That you're getting a great big boatload of my opinion today and next week. So you got to remember that is what they are, opinions. And I really want you to be coming up with your own logic about the way your letters are shaped or what you're doing in anything. And that is usually going to be a good enough reason to do anything if you think it works.
I have to add that I am the queen of excuses, but
Uh-huh.
when you live with a spouse that is an engineer, that doesn't always, you can't get away with that.
Yeah, who's saying this?
Pam, me,
Pam. Oh, hi, Pam. Good.
hi.
Yeah, it always depends on who you're talking to as to whether you can get away with that stuff. That's for sure. But the thing is that if he convinced you that he had some logic that that triumphed over your logic, and he convinces you to change your mind, then you have actually, it's not like you've given in. You just you saw that there was a better way to think of it, or an equally valid way to look at something. So it's, the difficult thing is when you're with somebody and you both have input on the way something is going to come out, and one of you has to win, but the other person isn't convinced. That's the biggest drag there is. So that if you're having a discussion with somebody about a technique and they make you see that it works or it can work in some situations, then it's not like you lost, you gained some new knowledge about it.
Right,
The big drag is when you have to go along with something you're not convinced of.
right.
All right. I think that takes care of that alphabet. You're just thinking as delicate a hairline as you can get, and pulled strokes for strokes that the pen would push. Okay. Is this something you want to try for a few minutes?
Yeah.
Or should we go on? Yes, try it.
Mhm.
Okay, it's 9:59. What do you need? 7 minutes. 10:06. We'll switch gears.
Can you place, maybe stack those two sheets that you worked on? If they, no, maybe not. No worries.
Could you do an S for me?
Sure. And S is the main one that is no different than a pen, other than the rigidity of the tool you're writing with, because those are 3 pulled strokes usually with a pen. But sliding, this is a very horizontal one, and sliding. The big thing that you want, and this goes for a pen too, as far as I'm concerned, is giving yourself plenty of place to overlap, and also concentrating on the shape of the counter that you're describing here, both the beginning and the ending of this first stroke. You want to give yourself plenty of roundness so that you can compose the shape of the counters. And then that slides in. And here, lots of overlap again. Let's do a more diagonal one. The thing that, especially with an italic, but really with all kinds of S's, capitals, bookhands, etc., is this stroke needs to be pretty horizontal rather than round. When you do this, an S is too heavy of a letter to start with because it's got a diagonal down to the right. It's the fattest thing that, fattest stroke that your flat tools make. And so by keeping the horizontal strokes horizontal, you're keeping the brush or the pen in a lighter, it's going to make a lighter mark. But when you curl down like this, you're adding 2 more diagonals down to the right, 2 more of the heaviest strokes possible, and the S is just going to beat the crap out of all the other letters on the page. So there's really no adjustment to the angle of the tool for this first stroke that you can make. You just have to say, this is the curse of the S, is that this stroke is going to be a little bit heavier. The great thing with a brush is that you can control that a little bit with pressure. So if you have a little bit lighter pressure here, you're not causing the brush to open up and give you a fatter stroke. But the real key is this stroke and this stroke are much more horizontal than these hooks that we did on this one in the middle.
Thank you.
Sure. The other thing that we haven't talked about here, but I'm doing a lot, is I'm not using my fingers so much to pull the tool. With a brush, if I plant my hand and make a stroke with just my fingers, you can't help but push the brush deeper into the page. And what happens is that it goes from this to this while you're pulling with your fingers. So all of these strokes, when you're working this large, are done with your arm. So the fingers are guiding it, but your hand is creating, your hand and your arm is pulling it straight without your fingers moving. And really the thought in your mind, or the vision, the way you visualize it in your mind, is to just think that you want the ferrule of the brush to remain at the same altitude over the paper throughout the stroke. Because when the ferrule gets closer to the paper, that means the brush is going from this to this and being forced open and giving you this unsightly, indistinct, bulging stroke. And so you can use your fingers to add pressure by pushing down deliberately. But if you're using your fingers to make the stroke, that's when you are losing control of it. I'm going to move this palette over to this side.
For the E, do you have a pull stroke for the beginning of the crossbar of that E to meet up
Yeah.
with that very small bowl, right?
Yes, yes. That's a great question. That's a really potent spot. I exploded that letter just for the heck of it. So let me do one that's closed because it doesn't matter. But however, that's a little too deep, but the crossbar is going to be the same no matter what. This has a lot to do with what we were talking about with the crossbars of the F, that you can start with the brush inside this stroke and pull out. The thing we don't want to have happen is for this stroke to get too heavy. I really like that to be quiet, but I'm also kind of crazy about having a little hint of it outside here. So I'm straddling that western border of the stroke with the brush, half in and half out, and making a little bit of a diamond. It gets you swelling on both sides of the stroke, but it's a quiet swelling. Let's do that again. You know, both of those, it feels like it's heavier on the left side than the right, and I really want it to be more on the right side. So I think what that means is I'm making it a little too narrow. So let's just make this a little bit more generous, and it gives this stroke, so putting a little less on the left side, yeah, the left side, and then room for that. to slide into it. Boy, I'm hating all four of those already. Let's see.
Why?
You know what? I'm just feeling like the left side of that stroke is dominating the right side. And I
Got it.
really want that thickness to be on the right side. We want, you know, this part that's sticking out here, that's bonus. That's a, you know, that's a flourish. It's non-essential, but
Got it.
the right side is essential to the shape of the letter. So when you're having an extra, you know, in an acting scene, take over the focus of the audience's attention, then that's an improper extra. You know, that's a person in the play that isn't understanding his purpose. So
Okay, thanks.
so that means I'm going to have just a little bit less there. There we go. That's more like it. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
You-
And
you're-
now that you've explained that and done that second one, oh, yeah, totally. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
But it's, you know, it happens. There's another place for this, and that is the bottom stroke of a P. I love to see a little bit of this poking out, and I also love these to be quiet. But, you know, it's just, this is a little bonus. When you have strokes that overlap, it's like a, you know, a formal Roman cap. That when this is inside the stroke, it's fine. But if we get a little of this, doesn't it feel more hand done? It feels just a little more human. It's definitely a little more casual, but there's something about it that is really saying that it's an organic thing that you're seeing. And so I love these little things that can poke out, but we just want that extra part to remember its place and not take over. Okay. Have you guys all been working while I've been jabbering away, because we went past our 10:07 deadline?
Yes.
Does anybody
Yes.
want to show what they've done so that that you're not happy with, that maybe we can figure out what happened, what went wrong? You know, this is the part of the class where I'd be going around and sitting with each one of you and seeing what you each did. And it's the part that makes me the most nervous about a Zoom class.
I have one I can dive in.
Okay,
I have a lot, but here's one.
okay.
Oh, I guess I can, let's see. Sorry. The bottom of the S, that connection, is it just a matter of watching better where your where your eye goes? I mean,
Yeah, you know, this is the most basic thing in calligraphy, I think that doesn't get talked about, and that is that you are composing the negative area with your positive strokes. So Sally, what you needed to be doing there was just watching that bottom shape
mhm.
rather than, so we're back on my camera, right?
Yes, you are.
So, yeah, so all I'm really doing more than anything, I'm not thinking as much about how this is going to slide in and be smooth for the stroke's sake. You got to be thinking about the counter space.
Mhm.
So really with this, you are making a blue mark, in my case, an indigo mark here, that is creating a white shape. And that white shape is arguably more important than the blue positive mark. So I'm watching the shape that I'm making with the way that this comes in. You just have to pay attention to the silhouette of the white. That is the shape that matters. You're
Right.
creating these shapes. Same thing is going to happen with the top, that, you know, you're visualizing that when you're making this first stroke, and then completing the second half of that with this one. Look what happens if we don't think about it to start with. There's just no way I'm going to be able to get a round counter out of this.
Mhm.
That I'm going to have to end up with some sort of point inside that. So you're always, always thinking about the shape of the counter that you're creating.
Right. Yeah, instead of trying to like hit that target. And I think that's what
Right.
I'm doing, trying to hit that target of that thin stroke. Yeah.
Here's the worst thing that can happen in that situation is that you're going to end up with, so let's say that we have this mark, and for some reason we didn't like this shape, and I don't not like it, but let's say we didn't, and we had to fix the shape of this counter by coming in at a different angle. The worst thing that can happen is that this stroke gets a little bit fatter. But watch what happens if we finish this, and by accident I made it too fat at the top. So that means that this letter is probably going to be thicker appearing than the letters that are after it, but really it's going to stand up because the white shape is more pleasing than the fact that we ended up with a little bit of a thicker stroke in some places. And let's say that I was making a quote here of an important speech by a snake, and so that this was my composition. And I get here, and let's say I love these first three S's so much that I didn't want to throw the piece out because of this bad S here. So we can always come back and fatten up some of these other strokes so that we have just changed what our thick to thin proportion is, and maybe save the piece. But then going forward, this becomes the new thin line. I know I'm splitting hairs here. I'm digging a deeper hole, but you get the idea.
That's really helpful. No.
That, you know, a good bowler is not the one who can count on his strikes. He has to be able to pick up the spares. So in calligraphy, there are lots of ways for you to try and save something. But an even more important skill is probably knowing when you've failed and you tear up that piece and start over. So.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Things you want to hold up to the screen for the class to ridicule? We're not like that. We want, you know, if you've got something going on, we want to try and fix it. Okay, ready for
Yep.
the next step?
Okay.
All right. Okay, I'm going to leave this brush here to dry out and pick up a pen. So we're just going to go to the next page. In your workbooks, it's listed as page 5/2. And again, when we have so few people in the class that have already been put through this, we have to go ahead and pretend that you're not here. It's review time for you, Sue and Fawn and Sally. The idea with I'm going to switch to a glove here for a pen. One of the ways to interpret the typefaces and to transform them is to have these different pen and brush techniques. So I want to go through these. I hope I'm not going to go too fast, but I don't want to linger on them too much because we want to get to the typeface stuff. But there are 4 marks that we can, 4 new marks that we can make with a pen that will transform a regular italic into a modern, more angular italic, and it helps us interpret and transform some of these typefaces. So the 4 lifts are on page 6. It's not numbered, but it's the one facing page 7 that catalogs these marks. And you know, in the Speedball textbook, for the first time, I tried to write down those instructions. So if you have a Speedball textbook and you need to refer to it later, what we're about to talk about, at least they're in there, page 38 and 39, but the same illustrations just with color. anyway, on page 5.2, the idea here is that lots of great stuff happens when you start to write with the corner of the pen, and the way you lose contact will give you a varying width that you can play with while you're writing. So the first most basic one is, if we make a letter like a C with full contact, that means that if we want a thin terminal on the end of this C, the only place we can get it is by staying along the path of the angle of the pen, right? But if you want to have a different kind of shape to this letter, this is prescribed by the angle that you choose. So that if we want to have a narrower letter with a sharper counter with full contact, we have to start pushing the pen into a thicker position. And we don't necessarily want that. So the first use of the corner of the pen is that when you're done with your thick stroke, you can just rock up onto the corner of the pen and you're drawing that upstroke with the corner of the pen and remaining at a thin line. So it means you can go lots of different places. In fact, let's make this C into an E that we get here. If we want to have a thin line kissing the vertical, we have to stay moving along the angle of the pen, which I always find a droopy counter like this to be a really sad thing. I like to have a little lift there sometimes. So this is a place that if you rock up onto the leading corner of the pen, we can have it smile a little bit and remain skinny if you want it to remain skinny. On page 5.2, there's actually a little bit of thickness here, and there's a different way to get that. In fact, this is a case where if you kept the pen down and you did make that smile a little bit, it's going to look fine. But this is a place where no matter which direction you're going, you keep the leading corner down and lift the back corner, and you're up on the corner of the pen to get whatever kind of shape you want. So that I can put a little bit of a curl here. The other thing that can happen is that you can be drawing the terminal stroke or the terminal mark with the pen. If you want a little ball finial, a hint of a ball finial, or any other kind of doodad there, when you're up on the corner, you can start to draw with that.
So
Is there a question?
which side of the pen are you keeping down? The left side?
The leading side. Who asked that question?
Chris Keswick.
Hey, Chris. What's happening here is that
Right, so the one that's in front. What's the leading side?
it's the leading corner, and that means the one that's in front. So in this case, I'm going to the right. That means the right corner is down.
Okay.
So look what happens if I use the back corner. What happens is you can miss
Yeah.
passing through that area. Whereas if you keep the leading corner down, it's making that mark, and you're not going to get this. You can use the trailing corner. I know people who do, but they just have to be really aware of where the leading corner was when they lifted the pen off the paper. So when I went back this way with the E, because I was going to the left side was the leading corner. And so see, I'm lifting up the back side, which is the right, and continuing to go with the leading corner, which is the left corner of the pen. Does that make sense? We're going to be talking about leading corner, trailing corners for some of these other moves, and it's really helpful to start to do that, start to understand that. Let's jump way ahead. One of the last things that you remember about this is that you can use both corners of the pen for all the marks I'm about to show you. There's an easy, logical place to start, but once you get used to getting up on the corner of the pen, you will use both corners in different directions, and that can change your results in subtle ways. So it's none of this is absolute, but the way I'm going to lead you through it to start with, the leading corner, trailing corner conventions are going to be an important way to start to get this. Okay, so that's drawing with the corner of the pen. We'll call that drawing with the corner of the pen. So on page 6, it is all the spaces, all the spots where you have an oval, and which is described down at the bottom there on page 6. So the most basic part, and the name of this alphabet comes from this mark, is the bounce. And by a bounce terminal, what we mean is with a classic italic, you make this turn and go sideways, right? So it's a turned terminal that is keeping you moving. And by a bounce terminal, that name comes from the fact that when we get down to the bottom here, we're just going to stop and have, instead of turning and going to the right with this, we're just going to spring up from this spot. And that's the bounce that we're talking about. But when we do this with full contact, because it's such a steep mark, we're making too thick of a mark. So this bounce is coupled with a lift, which is we're going to keep the leading corner down. And because we're going to the right, it's the right corner here, and draw the upstroke with that leading corner. Then we come back full contact. And it's just at these terminal spots that with the bounce, we rock up onto the corner of the pen in the direction we're going. And one of the few places where the opposite of this applies, meaning that we're leaving the left corner down, is because we're bouncing towards the left, like a J. So I'm bouncing to the left, so I keep the left corner down, and I've rocked the right corner up. But everything else on that page, I don't think I have another bounce to the left on that page. I don't. So it's usually going to be your right side. And the other thing that's happening here is that really important is that as you lift the pen, the bead of ink is slowly drawing across the width of the pen itself. It's like a curtain. Imagine a curtain being drawn across a stage, that as you write and you slowly lift, that bead of ink is not going right to the corner. Here's what happens. Here's the physical part of it, that you have full contact or you don't, right? But the variable here is that the bead of ink has its own thickness. You know what I mean? That when you start to lift, that cushion of ink that was across the whole width of the pen is starting to move towards the corner that's remaining on the page. So that's one of the really fun parts of this, is that you are writing with just the liquid when only one corner of this rigid metal pen is touching the paper. And that first place that shows up is that when we bounce, that little bit of ink, bead of ink, is giving us a bit of a bracket, or a transition from the thickest mark to the very thinnest mark. The bead of ink fills in there a little bit. So you don't have to lift fast, but just if you move, if you keep moving, that bead of ink will give you an organic look. It's a little bit hard to control at first. In fact, you ultimately will never be able to control it completely. When you lift the pen off the paper, you'll get a little bit of a surprise, but hopefully it will be within the margin of error and look okay. This is going to be even more important when we start to do the next two moves, the swashes.
Carl, excuse me, this is
Yeah.
more, just real quick, if you could move the back on the letters you were just working on. Yeah. Not to be obtuse, I'm confused with your upstroke on that last A. Which do you consider the leading corner?
It's
on
the corner in the direction that you're going. So because we're going to the right, that's the leading corner. Okay, and let me show you why you want to use the leading corner here.
Okay.
If we do this A, and in this case, I'm going to rock onto the trailing corner, the one on the left, and we do the bounce, look what happens. That upstroke comes out of the side of the stroke.
Yeah.
Right? So the leading corner is the one that is making the bowl more closed, and a little bit more traditional looking. So this, we want to avoid this porch or this extension here. That is really ugly looking, right? In the early days, I always worried about this, you know, these bounce things, that if I had to explain this to Sheila Waters, you know, that it would have to make sense to Sheila Waters, right?
Right.
And she wouldn't stand for this for 1 second, right? You can just imagine Sheila rolling her eyes in disgust at a
Yeah.
letter like this. But this one we can start to get away with, you know, especially since Julian does it. So
Yeah. Thanks.
yeah. Okay, so when we go to do a letter like an N or a B or an H, this concept here comes into play in a different way. So we make the stroke, rock up on the leading corner, and make our upstroke. And so we're up here, and see how I've got my right corner down. And if I didn't do anything and just laid the pen back down to make this stroke, here we've got this extension, just like here, that we do not want to have. So the move we have to make here to make an N or any of those related letters make sense is that you get up to the top and then you stop and you place the pen, the left corner where the right corner had just been, and make this stroke. And I'm not trying to round this off like a traditional italic at all. I'm letting the facet of the pen create the top of that letter, just like we're letting the facet of the pen create the terminal at the bottom of the letter. So it's really echoing what's happening here at the top. So it's bounce and upstroke, and then stop, replace the pen, and go from there. Now, one of the things that we were talking about slightly with the normal italic is that if we do an A with where we change the angle of the pen, and we did enough that we're right here, but let's say that if we flatten the pen out a lot and then go through what we just did with the brush, can you see how that is probably too fat of an upstroke? Even though we want the swelling, we still want to have a really delicate hairline in a place like this, right? So I'm really happy with how lightweight my horizontal strokes are and how bold my vertical stroke is, but I pay for it with the upstroke being too thick. So I can't go too flat with a fixed pen type letter. And the thing I always hated about traditional italics was that if you have a 45-degree angle, let's call that a 45-degree angle, what happens is with a slanted letter right out of the gate, that means that a 45-degree angle means that you get equal horizontals and verticals if the letter was upright. But because it's slanted a little bit to the left, that immediately gives the horizontal strokes a fatter look. Wait, let me get some more paper here. So here's really steep. And the big argument for a steep pen angle is that you get the most delicate upstrokes, but you pay for it with your horizontals being the thickest stroke on the page. And I don't know about you, but you should not want that T to be on anything you've ever done. The horizontals being stronger than the verticals is one of the biggest sins as far as I'm concerned. So the great thing about these bounce letters is that because we're drawing the upstrokes with the corner of the pen, you are free to do any kind of angle choice you'd like. So I can really indulge my my preference for a flat pen angle to get really punchy verticals and quiet horizontals, but you don't have to pay for it with a fatter upstroke. Does that make sense? That's why on page 5.3, there's a basic bounce with a flatter angle. And look how quiet that changes the horizontal strokes all the way through. We can always, with a T or an F, we can change this without there being any ramifications to the rest of the letter. But A, C, D, the bottom of the P's, the bottom of the B's, all of those things, we can have this really quiet, and you know what it does? It gives us basically a third thickness in our letters. The fattest one for the verticals, the skinniest one for the upstrokes, and then this quiet middle one for our horizontal strokes. So in a way, it gives you a richer letter all the way through. You have three thicknesses rather than just two. Okay, so let's see, is there anything else here that we have to worry about? Yes, the V and the W. Again, this is a place where when we bounce, you'll come up just as high as you need to come. And then we want to have some weight here, but we want this to be a swelling stroke. So this is a place, again, where we'll have a little bit of manipulation. You can come up with your thin line as high as you want, and then manipulate down inside. You're just wanting to concentrate on having as much thin line showing so that the A goes along, the V goes along with the A. Same thing with the W. So it can be a big manipulation there. When we get to the next technique, we'll find a way to supplant this. But if you're doing nothing but bouncing, you'll need to manipulate in the V and the W, and I think in the X. Let's see if we can get away with not with the real horizontal one. Yeah, we're going to need a little bit of manipulation there too. I would imagine that the colleagues have had workshops with people who like manipulation before, the bone stroke, that kind of stuff. I tend to stay away from that. I really like a nice, powerful, strong vertical stroke. And the big thing about manipulation is that with a pen, especially, it's subtractive. So that if we were going to do a capital B and you manipulate in and out, then there's just no way for the left side of the letter to be as strong as the right side. The right side has to pass through the thickest part of the pen in here. And when you've manipulated, look, I've taken away 3/8 of the thickness of that letter. So we end up with really inconsistent weights. And I just find that I save the manipulations for the thin parts or the thin edges of letters rather than the main part of the letters as a basic stance. But I'm ready to manipulate any place that it's going to give me the letter I want to have. But for right now, see if you can think about these letters being nice and powerful. We will have variations of this later.
So Carl?
Yeah.
It's, how do I say this? If we take a look at the A and you make that first stroke and then you bounce out of it using the leading edge, when you come up to the top, you're basically with your pen defining the width of the counter. Is that right?
Definitely.
There.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because it's
So,
easy to go a little wider than that. And then when you end up coming back up at the top, coming over to the right, and then going south, you want to actually just kiss the hairline that you made coming up, correct?
Pretty much, yes. And so let's say that you did make one that was pretty wide. If it's the first letter on the page, then you just sort of set up the whole page as having wide letters, right? But let's say it's later in the composition and you come across, then you're going to have to stop and think about it a little bit, Sue, and say, do I want this to have the same kind of width that I had in my previous letters, which means that I am going to chop this off. And, do I have to live with this corner in the counter space, or do I, can I come in here and see if I can, at
Yeah.
least smooth out the counter a little bit? There's all kinds of ways to try and fix the problem you've just created. But
Right.
I'm thinking that definitely when I'm writing like this, in fact, truth be told, when I'm writing at all anymore, I never want the letters to match exactly. I want each A to feel a little bit different, so that if somebody's looking at it for the first time and thinking, is that a typeface? Is that some sort of modern calligraphic typeface? Or is it hand lettering? I want them to be able to compare any two A's and see that it was handwritten. So if I ended up with a letter that had a corner in the counter in one of the A's and all the other ones were the same kind of width but had a smoother counter, I could live with that probably. It's always going to be an individual situation. Each one is going to be different, but I would go ahead and let this happen. Maybe see if I can do something about knocking the corner off the counter, stuff like that. But you are, to get back to your original question, you are always creating the shape, and that counter is everything about your width. When you're looking across a line of letters, the width is really being determined by how big of a white space you're seeing in all of these things, and you're hoping that they're in the same neighborhood or they have variety in a repeating pattern kind of way. So always watching the counter space. And then, yeah, you're right about this, where you're just trying to keep that backstroke out of the counter, so you got your smooth silhouette there for your sweep. Good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
Carl?
One of the other things, yes.
Sorry, this is Maura again. I
Hi,
have a
Maura.
question. I have not used the pen that you're using right now until I got, and
Uh-huh.
I just bought it. I thought I'd
Yeah.
try it. I noticed this when I was just even dipping it in ink as opposed to using gouache. I don't have good ink flow. I don't have good flow out
Yeah.
of this.
It's one of the main problems with these pens is when they're new, the way they polish them repels the ink for a while. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do. Wash them with Comet, get a sponge with a little Comet on it. And the abrasive of the Comet will rough up that stuff a little bit.
Got
Always remember you can go too far though. You can also use crocus cloth and just, do, circles on the crocus cloth with the pen in lots of different situations, lots of different positions. I started asking the guy who makes the pens for Horizon for paper and ink if he would not polish them. So they come not looking like a trumpet anymore, but they write better right out of the gate.
Yeah.
So when I'm traveling and I'm taking the pens with me, I'll ask him to make me 30 of the pens and not polish them.
Thanks.
But
Would it be all right to use toothpaste?
toothpaste is good. Toothpaste is probably safer for it than something like a kitchen cleanser. Yeah, toothpaste is fine. Some people always say that if you dip it in, is it gum arabic that can take away the shininess of a pen? A lot of times I just blast past it and press harder. Pressing harder helps.
Yeah.
And when I'm in class and somebody's got a really, a real delinquent one and won't fix itself no matter what you do, I'll trade them my broken in pen for their new one, because I know I can get past it later.
Yeah.
But it is a real frustrating thing when they're new.
Thanks.
While you're working on this is, I always find with new tools, new techniques, that if you're working with something that's familiar to you, that could be even better than this tool that I find ideal for working this way. So if you picked your fattest Browsen nib, or you had a 6.0, a 6 millimeter parallel, that those are good for these things too. So if, when you're trying these things, it's always great to switch over to a pen you're more familiar with, and seeing if that feels any better. But while we're talking about that, I really want to point out that, especially for the techniques we're about to do with the pen, that one of these pens is just too dry or too narrow to get the mark that we want. We're just about to do this. So if you're using a parallel pen, have a jar of ink open and use it like a dip pen. Doesn't matter if there's a cartridge in or not. You're just getting a little bit more of that, a wetter pen, so that you can use that bead of ink more effectively. And even so, they're still a little sharp for this way of working, but lots of people do work this way.
Thanks for the pro tip.
There we go. So I probably couldn't get that out of a normal, a normally interior charged parallel pen.
Yeah.
On that lower serif, are you still lifting up on the, well, which side is the, you're lifting up on the leading edge still?
Which part of which letter are you talking about?
The bottom of that G and those other two strokes you just made.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that technique yet.
Oh, okay.
It's coming up in moments.
Gotcha. I'm trying to make that the bottom of the B too, and I'm not sure how to do that.
Which page are you on?
Top of the 6.
Oh, top of 6. Okay. Yeah, that's the
One.
fourth technique too.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Those are two things we haven't talked about yet.
All right, I'll hold on.
If you go back to 5.2 or 5.3, the bottom of the B and the flourishes on the G and the F and stuff, these are places that I never want you to forget about these marks.
Sure.
Because in a way, let's do a B here and then a G. That when we just do a straight traditional flourish, full contact, the fact that this is square echoes this squareness. So this is always going to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's always going to feel right if you just stay with a traditional horizontal pull for the bottom of B's and S's and the swashes on any descender. So never forget that this may even be better than these pointed ones that we're just about to do. But the thing that's great about these is that they are also giving you more of a look at the, that awareness of writing with the bead of ink, because the bead of ink is completely creating these marks. And the fourth one, which is another flick, these are ways of losing contact that's creating a mark that can't be made any other way. But always remember that this is always going to fit in and echo what's going on with the bounces. So you're always good there. That being said, let's go ahead and go to that mark. So on page 6 and then 7, 6 catalogs the marks, and page 7 is an alphabet that uses all the marks. So let's talk about those final two. And I know lots of you probably already do this one way or another. And we're going to start with those descenders. We call this the leading edge, trailing edge swash. I know it's a catchy name. But what's happening is that if we have a finish line, we're doing a J, a lowercase j here, I'm sorry, a minuscule j. And we're done with our pulling and we begin to push. Can you see that that's the corner that's in front? That's the leading corner. This is the trailing corner, right? Because if this is a race, that's the corner that's going to get to the finish line first. Make sense? Leading corner, trailing corner. What we do is we lift the leading corner and keep going with the trailing corner. And when the pen lets go, if we just did it with a stop and a lift so that all of the ink trails down to this corner, all we would get is the corner, the trailing corner making the mark, and we get this fishtail look. you see this with a lot of people who like this look. Actually, they'll get just a little bit more thickness here, but and it'll be a little bit quieter. But that's the physical contact of the pen to the paper, right? But what we do is we're going to let the bead of ink fill this in to give us this triangular shape. So you've got to start to push, and then you lift the leading corner, continue with the trailing corner, and the bead of ink will fill this in a surprise way. Every time it's a little bit of a surprise. So we have a little hint of that fishtail here. Let's see if we can get a nice smooth one. That's a little bit better. So that's where the leading corner stopped, and then the rest is being filled in by the bead of ink as you lift. And there's lots of ways to do this. What's happening is that the trailing corner is describing the counter shape again. And the way you're lifting is letting the bead of ink, as it runs from the corner, when both corners were touching, the bead of ink is running to that corner, but you're moving while that's happening. So the bead of ink is making this variable mark until you're finally way up on the corner of the pen. So the bottom of an S. And any one of those flourishes, where else do we put that? Oh yeah, the vertical position of that. On a V, this is replacing the manipulation. So we'll make the bounce and stop. And now what we do is we place the pen vertically inside that line, and then do a lift. And the trailing corner goes a different direction, and the bead of ink fills in between it. So that was to do it slow, to show you the move. You don't have to do these fast, you just have to do it continuously. Okay, so there's where the leading edge stopped, trailing edge continues in a different direction, and the bead of ink fills in between them. The other place you can do this, I have it on that first S at the top. Leading edge, continue with the trailing edge. I kind of hate seeing this little dimple there, so I'm hoping that is going to end up a little bit smoother. There we go. Something like that. I honestly I'm not crazy about this mark, and I've got a much better looking mark that I'm about to show you with the last flick. But this is something that you can use in lots of places. I was doing the Menhart class a few weeks ago, and there's a place where you can get up on the corner, and once you're on the corner, you can start to draw. So I was getting more decorative with some sort of decorative letter. I forget what that was. So the places where I use it a lot, you can see, is the bottom of the flourishes, all those descender flourishes, and occasionally at the bottom of S's, but the move I'm about to make show you, you can also replace at the bottom of the S and the bottom of the B. Are you ready for that one? Okay, this is the leading corner flick. And so at the top of a C, we're going to set the pen down. And what happens is we're going to lift the corner and pull down with the corner that stays. The leading corner is the one that stays down here. We're going to pull down at the same moment that we lift, and the bead of ink is going to fill in for us. So there's lots of kinds of, depending on how you shape the mark with the corner that's still there, will determine a lot of its flavor. But I find just a little bit of a curl inward is all that it needs. Okay, so that's the leading corner flick, and it's again, this is one of those things that creates a letter or a mark that is less weight than our main strokes. So it's got that three-tiered thickness in your letters, that the fat stroke, the thin part of the pen when you're on the corner, and then this middle stroke or this middle weight for these other strokes. When we're doing the leading corner flick at the bottom of a letter, like the B, or you can also use it for an S. Let's do with the B first. That we get here, and it's always the leading corner that's doing this. So because we're going this way with the B, the left corner is the leading corner, and instead of pulling, we're flicking upward. So we're going to lift this and push up, and the bead of ink is going to fill that in a little bit. Okay, so it's just a hint of it. The other thing to remember here is that if you get a mark that you don't like the looks of, you can always touch up. While the ink is still wet, nobody will ever know you can shape these things the way you want it, especially with these descender swashes that if you don't, yeah, actually, I kind of like that one, so I probably wouldn't fix that one. Let's get one that has a little bit more of a fishtail. And you can see I hesitated there, so I would get that. Then you can just draw the shape that you'd like it to be. I always credit Dennis Brown with this one, is that he says 90% of all calligraphers touch up their work, and the other 10% are liars. There's one last little thing that the flick does to alter the look of that, and that is that you don't do the two moves simultaneously. So what happens here is that if you start to pull before you flick, you'll start to get thickness on both sides of the stroke that's moving towards the bottom. I hate it when it's got that square kind of look, but if you do it with the right kind of timing, let's see if I can you see that I've got a little bit of a spade shape there? And that indicates that I pulled a little, just an instant before I rocked onto the corner of the pen. And honestly, it's something that you almost can't control. I did it with control here, but it's one of those things that I'll just be writing and trying to do a normal flick. And if it happens, just because my timing was off, I always kind of welcome it. But as long as it's soft and it's got a little bit of that spade shape, I'm kind of happy with it. The other places where you can use this to even quieter effect is at the top of, on page 6, the top of the second A and the G on the bottom line, is that rather than drawing the full contact horizontal stroke, you can put the quietest little flick at the top of that stroke for an exploded, exploded looking letter with this hint of swelling. And the other place that it's happening there is on that first A, the two-story A. And that is, I like to, see, there's one of those places where I got up in the corner to draw. And now this one, it's the same mark, but because I'm going to the left, the leading corner is the left corner. So you're keeping that down while you were lifting the back corner to flick that direction. Okay.
You make it look easy, Carl.
My dirtiest trick. Is this a lot to absorb? Is this, are you getting a handle on it? I bet you a lot of you have been doing some of these marks all along.
So Carl,
There's
can I ask a question?
of course.
Yeah, when you were doing the leading edge, I'm sorry, I don't have my book open, so
Uh-huh.
if it's a matter of just looking back at the book, tell me. You talked about the leading edge swash and the trailing edge swash. The ones that you showed, were those all trailing edge? You know, the
Well,
ones on the bottom of the S and the, you know, the J stroke and the V.
yeah, actually, this is my fault for clumsy terminology, Sally.
Oh, okay.
That flourish, I call it the leading edge, trailing edge swash, in that we're lifting the leading edge and continuing with the trailing edge. And for all the years that I've been teaching this, you'd think I would have come up with a catchier name for it. And I haven't really thought of it, but
Oh,
but
okay.
really in your book, it does, you know, the triangular shaped indicated marks
Mhm.
are the leading edge, trailing edge swash, in that you're going lifting the leading edge, continuing with the trailing edge, and that's what gives this kind of shape.
Okay, because I was
And-
thinking of it as, quote, a trailing edge swash because it's sort of, that's the one you kind of lead with. So I
Well,
was just
yeah,
thinking
no,
that there was another one, but I get it now. Okay. And it's my
Right.
fault for not having my book open.
no, it's all right.
Okay.
Anything that clarifies what we're talking about is a good question.
Okay.
And then the other one we're calling the leading corner flick, because the leading corner is staying down when we're making this.
Right.
And this is one that works better when you do it kind of fast. The descender one, the leading edge, trailing edge swash, is something that you can do at a leisurely pace. You just have to keep moving. But the top one, the flick, really works better when you do it kind of fast.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
It reminds
So-
me of the old saying that if you're falling down a flight of stairs, you don't stop to count them.
That's good.
So you like some of it you just have to do and let it happen.
That is really true, Maura, that these things are still happenstance. You know, that I'm giving you everything you need to know to control them. But in the end, you ultimately don't control it completely. And that's one of the things that's kind of exciting to me, is that they can be different every time. There are things you can do to control them, depending on if you stay with the line being kind of sweeping and low, or if you go up, you know, you're sort of moving the pen into a fatter mark, and that definitely the counter looks a little different. So you can control it. The other thing that controls that mark is the how quickly you lift. Let me show you the wrong way of doing it first. A lot of people will start to do this, and what'll happen is that they'll lift to the trailing edge before they've started to push, so they get a mark that doesn't have any thickness there. That's just an indistinct mark, and it's because they lifted here before they had begun to push. So you've got to start to get a little thickness before you can take it away.
Yeah.
But you can control this by, once you've begun to push, to start to lift as soon as you begin to push. Whoops, you don't want to push the paper. So there might be just the littlest hint of thickness, or you can wait until you've pushed for a while and get more thickness. And you can see here that I'm having to doctor each one of these, but you'll get to where that won't happen. You'll be able to control that. Now, that being said, let me show you one more facet of this leading corner flick that I use quite a bit. And that is that so far we've just been doing it so that here's the width of the pen,
Oops, sorry.
and you're pulling down so that the thickness of the flick is only the width of the pen, right? But if we do that same mark where we're going to be lifting the back corner before we head south with the leading corner, you can do it over an arc. And you get lots of, actually, I'm more interested in this, where you can see right here is where the pen was in full contact, and you start to let go, and the leading corner is the outside, And this mark, this whole length of mark here is happening with the bead of ink. It's another reason this is a little exciting for me. You can see what a boring life I lead, that this is excitement for me. But the idea that you're making a really substantial mark with only the liquid. Or, another place where this works really beautifully is on a flourish to the left. So because it's the left, I'm going to be leaving the leading corner down, the left corner. And look how quiet that little bit of swelling that happens in, so I guess that's a J, it could be an R or something, or let's make it a P. So we can put a little leading corner flick there at the bottom of the bowl. But this is the same thing as that A, where we did this on the top of a two-story A like this, but it's just happening over, you gotta have a wet pen.
Hey,
And there's
Carl.
all kinds of marks that happen with this. It's different every time, but really attractive look. Yes.
Carl, did you say that was a leading edge that you were just doing, or a trailing
Right.
edge?
This is the one where we're leaving the leading edge down,
Okay.
and you can do it in either direction. Just remember that the direction you're going, that is the leading corner. So in this case, the pen was in contact on this side of the stroke and on this side. So that was done with the left. This was done with the right.
Thanks.
There's an alphabet, should be pretty quick. Yeah, on page 8, there's a bookhand that is using that leading corner flick over a big width, top of the C, the top part of that D, and the top of the Q, top of the S. Those are all the leading corner flicks going like this as you're moving sideways. The thing to always remember with the leading corner flick is that if you start to pull with the pen still down on the paper and then flick, you'll get that porch in there. And I'm not satisfied with the mark unless it's, smooth in through here. So you've really got to get the timing down to where, well, even that's, actually that's kind of a Menhart thing. We'll talk about that when we get to Menhart, but what we're really hoping for is that the trailing corner of the pen never starts to make, a thick mark, that the thickness is always coming from the bead of ink, and that will keep it softer on the underside there. I hope this isn't too much at once. What I would suggest on this is to just work with the moves that aren't resisting you to start with. And remember, we'll go back to that idea that a square full contact swash echoes the bounce and will always look great. So if nothing else, get that drawing with the corner and the bounce part and save these contact loss flourishes for later. They'll start to enter in as you get comfortable with being on the corner of the pen for your upstrokes of the bounce terminal. And you'll just know when you're ready. I found all of these techniques I found happened when I was, starting to learn, starting to feel my way with the contact loss, and then these other things happen, and I was like, how did that happen? What, it was an accident to begin with. And you'll start to make those accidents where you're riding along and you've got a loose contact with one corner of the pen or the other, and all of a sudden something will happen and you'll think, I just did that. How did I do that? And then you can start to introduce it, and hopefully the description of the lifts there in the workbook is something you can go back to at a future date. Okay, are we all set on those? do we need,
Yep.
do you guys need breaks? Were we talking about taking a break in the middle? I guess we're at the 2-hour mark. Sally, was there a break built in?
Said we would have a little bit of a break and we can figure out how long we want that to be. People want to get up and stretch and, you know, we can always just stick around too and talk, but you might want to get up and stretch as well.
I just wanted to give you a break. I'd be happy to stay and answer individual questions. If it's, I've got 11:07 here. What is that? 1:07 at your time. So 10 minutes?
Does that sound good, everybody?
Okay.
Yes, sounds good.
Okay.
Yes.
I won't present anything new for 10 minutes, and but I'll be happy to answer individual questions while you guys, you know, guzzle down a quick beer or whatever you're going to do.
All right, and I'll remove your spotlight then, so we can. I wonder if I should continue the recording? You think during this time? I mean,
Yes.
it could be valuable. Okay, we'll just have a really. It'll take forever to download, but that's okay. I saw you said about going and guzzling a beer, Carl. I saw a thing on, I don't know, it was just some meme or something, and it said, you know, when you're on your next Zoom meeting, have your wine in a mug and blow on it every once in a while, like you're cooling off your tea, but you're
Yeah.
yeah. Here, we had anyone who's still here, if I could be talking to nobody, that's okay. But we had Amy Sparks come and do a graphic note taking for us. Oh gosh, when was that? It seems like forever ago now, right? And Rebecca took notes of her presentation in graphic recording. And I'm going to show you my pathetic attempt at a graphic recording. Let's see. So here's, that's Carl. So there we go. Carl with his beard.
That's so
Oh.
cute.
The direction we're going in is the leading corner. I mean, I wrote that down just so I could remember, right?
Yes.
Because I'm always trying to think, okay, which corner am I supposed to be? So anyway, that's in honor of you there, Rebecca, the little,
I like it.
the little bubble.
Is that, and the H as well, is that it comes to a point in this lower left-hand corner.
Oh.
And what you have to do when you're looking at typefaces or any lettering source is to analyze what happened. And the thing that happens here with the N and the M and Ondine is that you have to do a little manipulation to get it to come to this corner. Or you could ignore it and have the stroke be a full stroke, and that means the upstroke is sort of appearing out of the full stroke. Here, let me do one both ways really quick for you. So what the three of you who showed did was you got here, and then you could have done the bounce technique, or just approached it without even a lift, so that we did see both corners of the pen and not the, so with Ondine, I kind of have to lean on this corner so that I'm then clear to have it come to that corner point like the typeface. And this is sort of a basic introduction to the idea of what you have to do when you're starting to do calligraphy based on type. Because the thing to remember about type is that no matter how calligraphic it was to begin with, it was then refined through drawings. And if a punch cut was made, you know, if a punch was cut to make the type, that is more drawing. And the type designer as well as the punch cutter, can make decisions to change it that is not faithful to what the calligraphic tool might have done. So you always come down to this dilemma of, do I try and make it as exactly like the typeface as I can, or do I let the pen act in a natural way, the pen or the brush act in a natural way, and just ignore that? So you guys who let this happen, you were thinking like calligraphers rather than somebody who is trying to reproduce the type. Both are completely valid. I tend to go this way and let the pen act naturally and just take whatever comes from the typeface that is, fits, that is expeditious to get it done, because I want it to feel like natural writing, unless there is a feature that the type designer has drawn into the typeface that you really want to capture. So let's say I was really in love with this feature of Ondine, which is that lower left corner coming to that point, then I would have had to make some adjustments to have that happen, like I did here, which was that I sort of lost contact it to a steeper point, so that upstroke, which is at a steeper angle than the pen angle itself, had to be altered. So this is when we start to look at any of these other typefaces, you get to make that decision. Am I just going to write and try and capture the shape that this typeface ended up in, or the unusual nuance of the way the strokes are made? If I can capture that without having to jump through a bunch of hoops, that's fine. Or am I willing to figure out what the hoop is that I got to jump through to capture the unusual thing that he may have drawn after he got going? Does that make sense? So this is going to be filtered through a lot of the stuff that we're going to do in the class from now on, is to try and think about making that decision. So before we go,
leading,
question.
that was the leading, the upstroke was the leading.
Well, almost always. So what I did here was, because I knew that I wanted this lower left corner to be the lowest point, I lifted the pen a little bit here and just finished the stroke down with the left corner of the pen. Then I planted it. You can plant the pen back in full contact and go up at the angle you need to go. Or I could have, now I can't remember, that I might have gone ahead and drawn with that corner. See, I was down on that back corner to make that point, and you could just go from there. So see, I was making my upstroke with the trailing corner in this case, just because I had to have been on the trailing corner for here. You can do these things in steps. So I could get this shape and then see what feels natural to come out of there. And if I'm going to the trouble of stopping the stroke and lifting, then I can put down the pen in the way that makes the most sense. And actually, for me, what makes the most sense at this point is to have full contact and slide along that angle. And I may actually thicken that stroke up a little bit. So there's somewhere between an H and an N there. So you can let intuition happen. It's just what's happening now is that we're looking at these letters as inspiration for letters that we're going to write. And you get to decide how faithful to your source you're going to be, or you're going to start writing with that as a loose inspiration, a loose beginning point, and see what happens as you start to write in a natural way. So all of these, it just means that you can approach your inspirational source in any manner that you want with these things. I hope that that makes sense. That again, this is just it's just a flavor suggestion. What do they call it when there's a box of some food and they show a plate of food and they say serving suggestion, not that it's going to come out of the box looking that way. So all of these typefaces that we're looking at, they're serving suggestions for what you're about to do. You get to make you get to be the chef for how the final dish is going to come out. While we're on that page spread, on the first page, there is some work by Hans Nienhazen, I think is how his name would be pronounced. And he was a German guy. I don't know much about him. He was in a couple of the early anthology books. And this list of 6 words here, all 6 of them have a really different flavor, but you can see that he was using a bounce stroke in all of them to different effects, up and down. So it just shows you that there's really nothing new under the sun. People have been doing bounce strokes for a long time. This is early 60s work. We tend to think of the mid 70s as being the explosion of modern calligraphic techniques, but boy, there are European people, European scribes that were doing lots and lots of different attacks with these modern marks for much longer than we were led to believe once we started watching Ken Brown TV shows and stuff. So on page 4, there's a really, I'm assuming this is a really familiar typeface to you guys. The typeface is called Arnold Bachlin. And I tend to think of this as the European typeface. When you travel in Europe, you see this everywhere, especially in Hungary. Every other sign was done in Arnold Bachlin. It's the quintessential Art Nouveau psychedelic poster typeface. And this is something that is obviously not calligraphic at all. That it was done as a drawn letter style. But there are some really unusual shapes here that I just haven't seen it. I can remember the very first time I saw this lowercase a. We had a fantastic sign painter in the town I went to college in, and he did a sign using Arnold Bachlin, but he really carefully chosen the place where he was going to use the typeface. And I always remember thinking I had never seen an A like that. So what I wanted to show you here was that this A from the Arnold Bachlin inspired all of these different A's in both the first word imagination and the 5 A's across the top. And they really don't look like his at all, except for the way that the top stroke comes down and hooks up somehow or other with the bottom bowl. So you can see that sometimes it's just the inspiration of shape that is going to set you off. And, and the rest of the word imagination doesn't have anything to do with Arnold Bachlin. But again, it's just that one letter, like in the slideshow last night, the charm capital C influencing that one letter E in that woman's name, Veronique. Okay, so what's happening there is that with the Arnold Bachlin, there is a lot of that movement, whether we bounce or not at the end of this stroke, but here it is the leading corner flick and rocking onto the corner of the pen. And then this was getting onto the corner of the pen for drawing this underside. So if this didn't feel thick enough, I know I could touch it up or try again. So just this interaction between the top stroke and the bottom bowl is sort of the theme for variations for that letter, and you can start to play around with that. I can't remember why I included this imagination. Oh, you know what it was, is that in the typeface, the capital I and the capital J have a serif that goes across, and then there's a jog before it hits the vertical stroke. And this is something that the calligraphy pen likes to do a lot. So it's just, there's just a suggestion of a movement there that seemed interesting. Or say if we look at that capital H, that there's a top and then it's going to flow down into that. Be careful, make sure that you drag your little finger through the wet ink over here if you want this kind of look. The other thing that happened here that we hadn't talked about yet is that you can lay the pen down. So I'm up on the corner, and as I came through here, the typeface suggested that there was a swelling stroke. So I'm laying the bead of ink down before I get to the full contact, and then you can lift it back up again. So that's that right side of the H, you know. So there's just one of the things that you can use as your source of inspiration is the roadmap of the letter, even though the calligraphic pen may not be able to get anywhere close to the flavor of the typeface, but there are innovations that can happen that can give you a whole new letter that you know, none of the kids on your block have started to use yet, or in your calligraphy society, your competition. Okay.
The A
So
looks
basically,
like a reverse
yep.
B.
Say again.
Oh, I think the A looks like a reverse B.
Yeah. And you know, and that's all about proportion, Sally. The you know, the typeface itself has
That
a
was
very.
That's right.
Who said that, Laura?
Maura,
That was,
it's okay.
Oh, Maura. Good.
Yeah.
So it's really what we needed to do. I wasn't paying that close attention to proportions, but it has a smaller top and then a much larger bottom stroke, so
yeah.
that, you know, we're feeling that. So, you know, you start with the idea of the action that the line is going to take, and then you start to refine it so you get the proportions the way you want it to be. Okay. Let's see, where do I want to take you next? That whole front section of the book is mostly my stuff before we start to get to type designers. What would be the next best step for us to take? Let's see. How about let's go to Gudrun Zopp van Hesse's typeface on page 39. Ariadne, which is it was all capital swashes. I mean swash capitals that was meant to go along with her Diotima typeface. And what can happen here is that you can see that she's got it's a flamboyant. This is the typeface itself. These are my interpretations of it. That it's a flamboyant swash cap, but you can assume that she had full contact, but she's got soft in and outs on, say, this capital B. Actually, you should always start with this stroke, and there's a loop there. And so when we start to look at swash capitals like this, we can start to substitute some of these marks that we made. And I just realized that I didn't show you the leading edge, trailing edge for a swash, but it works the same way. If we start going this direction, the left is the leading corner because we're going to the left. And you lift the leading corner and continue at the trailing corner. And the reason that we always do for that kind of a mark that we're leaving the trailing corner down is that the trailing corner is always making the inside of the curve. If we were doing a swash and we lifted the trailing corner and continue with the leading corner, the bowl would have an interruption. But when you're keeping the trailing corner down, the bowl is always being done by the trailing corner. So we have a smoothness. A capital T for that instance, for that matter, is there's the leading corner, continue with the trailing corner, it's the inside of the curve. The swash, like this swash on the B, the leading corner is now the left corner. We lift and continue with the trailing corner, which is the right, it's the inside of the curve. And then the bottom of the T would do the same thing. If we were going to the right at the bottom, you know, James Hayes calligraphy always had that triangle. So a lowercase n in a classic Hayes bookhand would look like this. That is a leading edge, trailing edge mark right there. He always got a perfect triangle out of it. So that would suggest to me that he had to touch it up, because I can almost never get it exactly out of the pen, but I came close over here. So always the trailing corner is creating the inside of the curve with that kind of a mark. So with Ariadne, we can start to interpret Gudrun's moves with that lift. We have a bounce here, and then this is going to be the leading edge, trailing edge in the upward way, but it's going out. But see, you know, those ones I was showing you before, the trailing edge was going inward, but it works the same way when you go out. So there's the leading edge stopping and the trailing edge continuing. And then with a move, if you, whoops. Let's pick it up from the middle of the stroke. So bounce, and then okay. So the leading edge, trailing edge is a great way to get in and get a little bit more exotic look out of these innovative but fairly classic swash caps that Mrs. Zopf created for this typeface. And you can see on that same page that there is, at the top of the page is Variante. Joachim Roman did that in 1951. And if you look at the letters themselves, you can see that that really feels like pointed pen work. But there's no reason that we can't pick up some of the exotic roadmap moves that he did with the swash and start to play with contact loss and see how the letter becomes transformed when we're using that just as loose inspiration. We're not really coming close to what he's done with the pointed pen, but we end up with something new with a flat pen. And then once that begins, then you can start looking at, you know, any kind of swash, the gorgeous swash caps in Palatino cursive, the italic of Palatino. This is one of the saddest things in all of digital type, is that there isn't a there isn't a digital version of the swash caps that went with Palatino. It's really a shame. But again, you know, those kind of moves can help that that come along. So on those next few pages, there's lots and lots of different script typefaces that hold these little secret moves that you can start to interpret with some of the marks that we were making this morning.
Can you do an example of the capital A swash letter?
Yeah,
Page
from
39?
Ariadne?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I would start here, and you know, you can see that that is a curved stroke. The beginning of that is a curved stroke, and I may not want to keep the pen sort of set, because we would get a swelling that she doesn't have. But we could also try it and see what it suggests. Actually, I kind of like it. I like it better than I thought I would. I thought I was setting us up there. Did Sharon ask that question?
I did.
Um, I thought I was going to kind of move the pen, rotate the pen to keep it thin to catch her flavor. But when I did it with the pen staying in that angle and full contact until I got here and did the lift, then the swash, I think this is a swash that's going to be better off for us to do in 2 steps. So we'll keep full contact for the horizontal part of it. And let's go ahead and do that stroke. And then here, this isn't a bounce, but once I was through with the fat stroke, I lifted up onto the corner so that when I made that gesture, it would stay thin. If I'd kept the pen in place and did something kind of quickly, I would get thickness. And I knew I didn't want thickness there, although I messed it up with that second stroke. Now, this is the place where we're going to have our other lift. I wish that was smoother, and nothing is happening with her crossbar, but that doesn't mean that you can't put something in there to have that crossbar do something. So let's, you can use this lift. What's happening here, we didn't talk about this when we were talking about this in the first place, but another place that drawing with the corner of the pen happens is that if you do a horizontal stroke and you get out here and you have full contact and you want to do something to the end of a stroke, look how you're moving into the really fat part of the pen. But if you lift, then you can do some sort of curly cue at the end of the stroke without it putting this gigantic, slug of ink on the page that happens with a full contact. So there is probably the most useful of the 4 techniques is just this idea that you can always get up on the corner and draw with it to get a subtle OG curve in your stroke without it turning into a big thick and thin reveal that we would get here. Because the last thing we want our attention to go to on a stroke like this is this ending. And if you can quiet it down with the corner, that's really the most valuable thing. I just realized that I did give you an A here, and it really looks like I did just about the same thing, although the proportions are way different. So it's nice to know that through all the years, still being consistent with that.
So those 2 swashes were done with the trailing edge, is that right?
The leading edge, trailing edge, yes.
Yeah.
And no matter which direction you go, the leading edge is on the outside, the trailing edge is on the inside of the curve, and it's always the inside of the curve is the place you want to put your attention for lots of reasons. Next week, we'll talk a little bit about the pointed brush, and there's a really important thing that happens on the inside of curves when we talk about the pointed brush. So let's see.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have a pointed brush that you suggest?
Yeah, the materials list was taken from when I was going to come teach. So I can't remember if we talked about this or not. Sometimes when I teach this class, there's just so much to cover with a flat tool that we don't even mess with a pointed brush. But I find a Pentel color brush is really, I have lots of expensive pointed brushes, but I always grab this thing first. It's so responsive and so springy, and we'll come back to the point in such a great way that there's just nothing that beats a Pentel color brush, I think. As much as I love, specialty brushes, they all have their flavors, and this one is so sharp. So was a Pentel color brush on your materials list?
It was.
It was.
Okay.
Would you say that that's what this is?
Pull it back a little bit. Yes,
Oh.
that's a Pentel color brush.
Okay, because I'm not
Yep.
seeing it written anywhere on it, so.
Right. Yeah, I never thought about that. If you still have that, see this silver band that's on it, there's a
Yeah.
tiny little thing here that says Pentel on it.
Oh,
Does that say
yeah,
color brush?
it
Oh, it does
does.
say color brush.
Yeah, it
Pentel color
does.
brush.
Okay, good. We're all set.
And there's lots of variations of these things. Have you seen those water brushes, the ones with the blue handles, the clear blue handles that you can fill with whatever you want? Those are, yeah, like that. Those have a very similar brush to the Pentel color brush, and they work great. But let me tell you about those brushes. You don't want to put stuff in the handle and have it go through the brush, because it lets out too much liquid and you'll be writing too wet. And I find that there's a certain amount of grab or traction that a brush has when it's the proper amount of dry or wet, and I always found that those blue handled ones let out too much. You're always working wet, and it doesn't grab a hold of the paper the right way.
Do you ever
for my-
dip the water brush, like have the
Yes,
barrel
that's
empty and dip it?
yes. That's the only way I use those, is that use it for gouache, use it with ink, but just dip it so you can control it that way.
Right.
The other one is just that the valve that lets the liquid come out is a little looser than the Pentel color brush, and it just is always flooding the brush, so it's too wet. All right. So let's see. I was so intent on getting us to this point that I forgot what I was going to do afterwards. In the interest of getting these techniques, these pen control techniques out of the way, let's add the one last thing to this, and that is losing contact with the paper during the main stroke. And this is the place where it really starts to get kind of abstract, but those of you who use a pointed brush or a ruling pen, you are already dealing with what we're going to start doing with the flat pen, and that is lifting the pen off the paper and having the stroke have variable weight controlled by the lift. So on page 9, there's a piece that says, not one shred of evidence supports the notion that life is serious. And the N is the place that you could start with this. So far, all of the lifts we've been doing have been at the edges of the letters. And we now want to bring it into the main stroke itself. And the thing about the N's, say both N's in the word notion, is that the front half of the letter is full contact. And then the second half is where you start to lift the pen off the paper during the stroke. And again, you can see it happening. This bead of ink is drawing across the width of the pen. So when we're talking about losing contact, it's not this gigantic quick lift that gives us this really abrupt, skinny stroke that is not going to stand up to the full contact stroke across from it. But we want to start to control and sculpt the way that, that stroke is tapering with the loss of contact. So really what I'm hoping you'll do in letters like this, and you can use either corner, is to just lift a little bit and watch the pen, the width of the stroke recede while it's continuing to have power, because this is still a main stroke. And then no matter what you're doing, then you'll be able to start to control it on all the letters of all the strokes of the letters. But you'll see that one that I'm starting with there has plenty of full contact strokes, which means that you have to start to control the ones where you are lifting to get an exotic shape. You have to control that enough to keep that side of the stroke feeling like it's in the same neighborhood of weight as the full contact strokes.
Carl, are you using a folded pen?
I am, yeah, this is the Horizon. So, you know, if you have an old Coit, it's the same kind of mechanics, or those Hero poster pens that were folded. I like these because I've always been a little bit shaky and I have to lean on the pen a lot. And a flexible pen makes me nervous. Like automatics, way too flimsy for me. Last night there was a woman from Germany in the talk, Petra Pussel, and in Neider Akbach, there was a guy who was making pens, and he made automatic style pens, you know, which is two pieces of metal coming together that aren't connected, but the spring of the pen is pushing them together to make a thin line. And those are made out of what, like aluminum or nickel or something, and they're so flimsy that I don't like the give that they have. And he made automatic style pens with heavy brass like this, and they act a little bit more like a folded pen. I'll dig that out and show you next week. All right, so this leads us, you know, once you get the idea of controlling the thickness of the stroke by doing letters like the Life is Serious quote, then you can start to lose much more contact with the paper and get much more sculpted type of strokes, like the Schrift graphic on 11, or the Be Done With It at the top of page 11. Lots and lots of lifted strokes there, and you'll see that it fits right into working with the lifts that we were talking about already, as well as these sculpted strokes. So that letter B is lift here. Just the slightest bit of the leading corner flick for that. This one I got from John Stevens, you know, in Gothic letters that have a straight vertical decorative stroke, that can be a lyrical stroke as well. So this is one where you can use that leading edge, trailing edge in a real quiet way. And I like to end strokes with that. So this is one that begins in the middle and then is picked up and finished there. So just the tiniest little bit of a leading edge, trailing edge. And then this upstroke is, I guess you guys are ready to hear this. Once you start getting used to rocking up onto the corner of the pen, you may be able to stop thinking about which corner you're rocking on. So that this is a case where you really can lift either corner off. I'm going to keep the trailing edge down on this, but just like this one, keep it really quiet and let the gesture, oh, darn it. Let's see. I really should practice before class. There we go. So there's just a little bit of a hint of thickness here as I lost contact with the leading edge and kept going with the trailing edge. Worked out a lot better in the one in your book, but we're gonna have to touch that up. And then this stroke here is full contact, but as we come this way, we rock up onto the corner of the pen for an extended, you know, a little bit farther than we were talking about it earlier. And once you're on the corner of the pen, then you can start to draw. And at any point, there was a type designer named Ed Bengot, and he told me once that you can stop and take a drink of water anytime you're lettering, which means that you can stop a stroke and think about what you're doing and then plant the pen again to get what you want. And this is another one where we're lifting here and then drawing with the corner. I hadn't completed that, but there we go. And then here is a partial contact right from the start, that if you put the corner of the pen down and then just start to lay it down, I just love the fact that you can make a mark that is half the width of the pen at the beginning of a stroke. So there's lots of ways to get these partial thickness diamonds in your letters. And then some of these other letters are contact loss, flicks. So all of these are, you know, partial contact to one degree or another. And you can see that this will give you lots of flexibility. Oops. To interpreting your letters, whether you're looking at some other calligrapher's full contact calligraphy or a typeface. Is that making sense? That E in the word done is, you know, once you're up on the corner of the pen,
Leading edge and continue with the trailing edge.
you can do a little bit of curly Q action. There's an A that I always used to like to do. But once you're on the corner, there's lots of decorative possibilities for drawing and over decorating a letter. So that's sort of what was happening. What was that page with Ariadne? Did we say 39? Yeah. So this, the letter style from up above Variante, you can see with all those swelling and receding strokes, this paper may blot a little bit. There's lots of places where you can start to use this idea of lifting and laying down the strokes. That R has such a unusual partial and then a connection, and that goes into the bowl. You can lift here, so you can extend that that thin part of the letter for longer, and you could also start to lift during this. So lots of variations. Your decision on how much lifting you're going to do. Maybe you can go through all these letters without lifting your main strokes and see what happens, and then go back and try it with lifts and see how it changes that. That Z. And remember, you can always lift your pen for an extended thin line and then stop the stroke, lift it off, and lay it back down. Because when we're on the leading corner, the left corner here, we may not want to just lay the pen back down, but put the left corner, I mean the right corner where the left had just been. And the corner always lets you give a longer kind of a loop if you need to. Again, this is the time in the class where I'd be turning you loose to just say, go pick a typeface, go pick a letter source, and one that appeals to you, and see what happens when you add in these lifts and see what happens. But our time is too short for that. We're in our last hour already.
Would that be a good homework? Or do you have other homework?
Oh, well, that is homework. Yes, definitely. Um, I was going to give you one other idea about that.
Oh, you can do it later. I was just curious.
Okay.
I mean, you can
Yeah.
do it when you planned on doing it.
Yeah. There's another one that's just tailor-made for the leading edge, trailing edge swash, and that's on page 45. Uh, this typeface called Arabella with these long horizontal lower swashes that is just begging for the leading edge, trailing edge swash. Look at this end, really faithful to what the typeface is doing, but it ends up with its own flavor with the swash happening there. So just some obvious places to use the those lifts that we were talking about, and then some quieter places as well. Now, the other thing that you could be doing, of course, is interpreting some of this stuff with with a flat brush, and the flat brush with its restrictions of only having pulled strokes, and the flat brush also has trouble losing contact with the paper, that you may find that those limitations will turn into possibilities when you start to write with a flat brush, interpreting some of this stuff as well. Okay. Let's talk about Menhart. He is someone who, remember, he was a calligrapher, but he was a type designer. So in the end, whatever he was writing, and let's see, on page 53, there is 2 uncial alphabets on the top left, and then his typeface, Unciala. And so he wasn't trying to do anything tricky with the 2 alphabets that he wrote at the top. But then when he got to the typeface, that there were places that, because the punches were being cut, that he could make some changes to the letters that were drawn. So in lots of cases, there are just some things that you may not be able to do with the type, when you're writing it with a pen. And when you're looking at calligraphy, it's much more straightforward. So these are some places where you can try some of his unusual shapes, or you can look at the typeface and see what happens. And I've got a couple of tricks to show you with this that's going to lead us towards some future stuff. But let's talk about this, the uncials and what's happening with his wedge serifs. He was a big one for a wedge serif. And I'm sure you've all written with wedge serifs before, but there's something that's really important to think about with them that we can talk about now. And that is, when we make a stroke, a wedge serif can be just setting the pen down next to the stroke and pulling a diagonal stroke into the main stroke. Your basic idea for a wedge serif. But the thing that's really important to realize about one of these wedge serifs is that this is increasing the weight of the vertical stroke. And I always feel like so let's turn this into, in fact, let's do one of his weakest letters, and that is an R or a B. Do you guys like this R? Yeah, that's good. Rebecca did a wobble with her hand. The reason that this is so uncomfortable is that there is double thickness here, and it's right next to this place where we have the very thinnest line that's happening. And this is an extreme example of the wedge serif beating up on the rest of the letter. So even if we did have it in a place that there wasn't this much interaction between the thin and the thick strokes. So let's say capital H with ink. That when this feels too fat, all the tricks that you might try to get weight happening in the rest of the letter will be undermined by how fat this is, because we're creating a stroke here that is fatter, much fatter than the thick stroke that the pen is making. So what I'm really hoping you'll take to heart here, and not everybody does, is that the more horizontal you make the diagonal stroke, the less obtrusive it is to the rest of the letter, while still having the power of a wedge serif. And that is one of the great things about a wedge serif, is that it is really giving you kind of an attack on the page that that's adding this, this force, this emphasis to the words that you're writing with this. And so the first thing is, the more vertical you go, the more you're turning your thick stroke into a much too thick stroke.
Mhm.
And the more you move horizontally, you're tempering that, even to the place where you can go much more horizontal than you may have seen a wedge serif go before, and get a still powerful and still really interesting looking stroke, but that is much quieter. So the more horizontal you go, the more you're quieting down that strength there. And then the other part of it is how you're letting the push strokes, or the strokes that well out from the vertical stroke, to add a little bit of weight to those letters. So rather than having, just this has always been one of my pet peeves about M's and N's in uncials, that if you just set the pen here and go, it makes this vertical stroke belong to the left half of the letter. And then the right half of the letter just feels like, an addition to the house that was nailed on really clumsily. And I feel like one of the most essential parts of an M like this is the fact that it should start inside the vertical stroke and spring out. And that this swelling stroke, this pushed swelling stroke, allows the second half of the letter to claim the center beam as much as the first one. So it's really essential that we get that. And that's one of the solutions over here to Menhardt's. This feels just so naked and open up in here because it's next to the wedge serif. So if we take an R like that, first of all, we temper the wedge serif a little bit, but then we add the push out that takes the thinnest part of the stroke away from the thick stroke, and we have this transition that distributes the weight throughout the rest of the letter in a much more pleasing way. And of course, let's jump ahead to page 63 for just a second. That here's sort of a brush version of the check uncial. And any place that you have those with a flat brush, you're going to have to pull those strokes to imitate the push. And frequently, I find that even with a pen where you can push that stroke, it may be more controllable by pulling this stroke. That's a place where you can really start to control the weight of the stroke, rather than, what's happening when you're doing a push stroke is that you really can't see the stroke you're making because the pen's in front of it. So I can't see this as it's happening, and I may not be able to control the swelling quite as much. Whereas with this, you're revealing the stroke as you pull. So a pulled stroke is almost always more controllable. than a push stroke, just because you can see it. Now, talking about these wedge serifs, there's a moment in the uncial typeface, the Czech uncial unciala, it's called in Czech, and that is the W and the N have a place where the wedge serif, here, let's put a wedge serif to start with. The wedge serif in the middle of this letter is created by crisscrossing these two strokes. So we get a wedge serif out of two simple strokes. And there's something about the economy of that that just has always tickled me no end. And we can do that in his, the N also has one, but the N is a tricky letter in that when this crosses over, this kind of an N wants to get to a thinner line than this angle might suggest. So this is a place where once you start this stroke, you can flatten out the pen angle so you get that thin line in the middle, you know, reverse of what a Roman proportion would do. Whoops. I was drawing the top of that serif there. It's not cheating, but it's a safer thing to do. That what I really like is to just set the pen down next to it and make the wedge and hope that my placement of the pen is giving me a straight silhouette there. But to be sure, you can either start with a slide before you do this stroke, and then you know you've got a smooth top and just set the pen down in there, or make the first stroke, the main stroke first, and slide from there before you pull the wedge serif in. Anything, those things feel are legal, but I really like this challenge of having, you know, just setting the pen side by side and having that go. I think that grew out of black letter. You know how with a black letter, you make this stroke and then just set the pen here so it's kissing. But hopefully you're getting a straight line and no hint of a thin line. That's the danger of sliding. Whoops. Is that if you're not careful, you could be leaving a little bit of thin line showing. So I always felt like, here's the challenge. You're putting two blunt strokes next to each other to create that line, and you know you're not going to get any thin line from a slide. Plus, it also sharpens your pen placement skills. And that, so I always brought that same kind of thought to making a wedge serif when, you know, sliding is going to give you much more control. I always like the idea of the challenge of setting the pen down and creating that straight line.
One on the W again, that's going to that rather thin line. I think I missed that one.
This, the last
Yeah,
one?
yeah. Or I guess the last two strokes, you know, the thin
All right.
line. And then, yeah, thank you.
He had a much flatter angle than I find myself when I'm not thinking about everything. That, see what happens with this when I've got the angle of the pen, it makes the right side of the wedge feel too lightweight compared to the left side. And we want to get that balance. So I'm going to flatten out my angle here a little more. And then here, I think the safest thing, Sally, would be maybe do a slide. And at this point, you know, we have this angle, we're trying to maintain the angle all the way across, but we want to control how thick this thinner stroke is. And this is a place where once you slide, now is the place where you can manipulate just a little bit, not during the stroke, but as you start to make the stroke to get the angle you might want for the thickness for that stroke. And then you've set yourself up for the wedge serif that can go here. There's a really beautiful spot in, he wrote a really wonderful book for high school calligraphers called Nauka Opismu, and it's on page 67 in your workbooks. And it's sort of a halfway to a Neuland in that it's a thick and thicker alphabet. And notice he's got the crisscross serifs on the N and the first A and the M for a pretty straightforward Roman style letter. And you can see by the two sets of double M's next to it that I was just crazy about those M's. But it's that same deal where he's going just two crisscross strokes that also supply a wedge serif. And I was trying lots of different combinations. You see, I put it on the two MMs next to it. The top right one has the crisscross serifs on the right side, sort of to balance out the other. In fact, I'm sure that these were done in the year 2000, that I was doing, you know, double M's for the Roman numerals of 2000. And so I was trying to get sort of a symmetrical thing happening with the wedge serifs on either side on that one, and then really extending it. But these are really fun letters. If you're into Neuland's, this idea of having that you're choosing the relationship between the thick stroke and the thin stroke, that the ratio of thick to thicker is really up to you. So these letters could be, you know, really thick and thin, or you know, this is still skinnier than that second stroke, but much fatter than a normal Roman proportion. So lots of things can happen with that too. While we're here, as well as in the uncial typeface, let me show you one of Menhardt's characteristic letters. You can always tell, you're playing Name That Calligrapher. One of the things to look for Menhardt is that his S's, he loved to have a horizontal center. So he was, must have been influenced by, you know, certain black letter styles, that he wouldn't have one diagonal stroke in the middle. He always liked to try and get the center of an S going kind of horizontal. And you'll see that in lots of places, that Weissrad across the way on page 66, or the S in the Czech uncial, and both of the S's in the written italic up above that. That he always had this swing through a horizontal. So if you're doing a more Roman letter, he would do a lot more of this. And that shows up in lots and lots of different variations of his letter styles, that he loved that horizontal S. Okay, on page 65, as long as we're talking about his uncials, that quote, the script, the smaller script was done with a pointer brush, but the capitals were done with a flat pen. And this is a case where I was looking at the Czech uncial typeface, but doing lots of lifting, and like say, oh, the R in Bardo. All these places where once you're done with your thick stroke, you can let that thin line fly for a while and start on your corner before you lay the pen down and lift during the strokes. Slash drawn serifs with the corner of the pen. Did we have a crisscross? No, we left the wedge serifs off because this is a much lighter weight looking one. Those are the O's, the capital O's were started with full contact, and then once you're around this side, you keep the corner down, but you keep the angle shallow to the paper. So if this is the paper, the pen is just lifting like this. So there's that bead of ink in between. And as you start to make this stroke, what will happen is that you'll get, if you have just a slight contact, no, that's too much, sorry. There we go. So there's just a hint of thickness on the right side of those letters. So you'll, after a while, you get the feeling, that touch for how this could happen. And it doesn't always have to be the leading corner. This one, I lifted the right corner because it was leading, and continued with the trailing edge, which is making the inside of the curve. That was where the pen was touching, right? Now, if we do it the opposite way, and I'm going to leave the leading corner down so that the counter space is being made by the side that's not touching, a different kind of thing happens. Don't do this while you're on the phone with your friends. Don't talk. So let me get it straight. I'm keeping the right corner down. There we go. You'll start to get a more exotic look that I'm just not capturing today because of my shaky hand. But all you young women are going to have your nice steady hand to do these kinds of letters. Lots of places where you can just be starting with the beginning of the pen, touching, and then losing contact right away. And his unusual proportions start to give us unusual shaped letters. Okay.
Carl, I have a question. It's Jill.
Sure.
Does the folded pen behave in a different way than the Pilot when you're lifting?
The thing about the Pilot, it's so sharp that it doesn't have as wet of a bead of ink so you'll get lots more of those points where you can really see where you lost contact and kept going with the corner. So those are places where you're going to want to be either dipping the pen to make sure it's nice and wet, so you have a cushion of ink there. Yeah, that turned out pretty good for the first try. Beginner's luck. But you'll probably find places where you'll see that corner that happened there. And the other thing, because it's so sharp, it caught the corner and did a splatter. Sometimes that can be really fun to see, and other times you'll think that it messed up your whole thing. But it's the sharpness that makes full contact so distinct when you're starting to write with these things. But when you start to lose contact, you're going to really want to have that that cushion of ink and dip your pen so that you will have more, that will give you more fluid stuff. And if I wasn't so lazy, I might go in and start to doctor these corners, just blunt the corners a little bit so that they wouldn't catch like this. The beautiful thing about the folded pens is that because the brass is so heavy, that when it goes around this corner, it's really softening that corner. And that means that the corners are not as sharp as something like, the parallel pen is two really thin blades stuck together. And the fold is actually softening that corner a little bit. So I think that's why I prefer those. So on page 62, there's a bigger look at the check unschel in the black. These white letters in the black is unciala, or the check unschel. And then the black letters were done with a pen, and using that same idea of the Nauko Pismu piece, where you're choosing the thickness of your thin strokes. And this starts to move us towards a Neuland. Where you're turning towards the thickness, where, you know, in a normal pen, once you headed back towards the left, you would get a thin line. So with any kind of Neuland style, and this is a real easy transition to this because it's not full, thick, and thin, where you're just choosing the thickness. And the other thing you can always do is when it becomes uncomfortable to keep turning towards the thickness because your hand is bending back uncomfortably, you can stop and come from the other direction. And rather than just having corners meet, you draw to the back of the stroke. And that way you can get your, you know, you can modulate your thin line, your thicker thin line with these kinds of letters. So, you know, some of the easy place to start here would be letters that feel the most thick and thin, like say that H, a wedge serif that is not particularly deep, and then choosing angles at the start of your strokes and turning towards the fat. So his famous horizontal center S, you're turning into the thickness and then back into the thickness again. So just subtle little manipulations that only happen in the places where it changes direction rather than a constant manipulation. If we were to talk about a Neuland, that should be the next natural step. But a Neuland C, let's look at the typeface for a second, because this is so closely related to that. I think CoC follows, yeah, he does. So page 78 is the typeface, Neuland. And a lot of times when you think of a monoline letter, you're thinking that the pen has to continually rotate to maintain the fattest angle of the pen. But this is a really difficult thing to do and control the shape of the stroke as well as controlling the thickness. So one of the secrets of the Neuland is to see how diamond shaped, or diamond shaped, I guess is the word we want to say for a letter like the C. And the thing that makes life so much easier when you're thinking about a Neuland is that these strokes are arched strokes that don't have manipulation. So that C is more of a diamond shape, and the only manipulation happens when you change direction. We're going to end up here. So the pen manipulates or changes angle. Come on, show the angle change in that one spot. So you're going, it's an arch stroke, meaning that it's got a curve, but I'm not changing the angle until I get here where I change direction. And then you can turn into the thickness of the letter. And you have this Fred Flintstone's ear kind of a C. And if you look on the left side of the page, you'll see the different point sizes of the typeface, and there's a different look to the letters all the way through, especially those C's. Look how nearly straight line the C is in Customer, and then the Cleveland is leaning forward a little bit, like the C in Cleveland is leaning forward like this one. So there's lots of different funkiness that you can put into the Neuland that actually makes your calligraphy job a lot easier. If you've never heard about the typeface, the reason that it's called Neuland, which is new land or a new frontier in German, is the fact that CoC had been designing type for more than 10 years, but he had never tried cutting the punches himself. He just did the drawings and sent them to the foundry's technical place where they did make cut the punches for the type. And you know how metal type is made. A punch is cut that looks very much like the type. So they cut away areas. So if we were making that C, you'd cut off this corner, cut out this counter, cut off this corner, and then cut these out. So you're cutting this away to leave a raised letter. It looks just like the type. Then there's the next stage is a matrix where they have soft lead inside a shaft, and you put the punch in and strike it with a hammer, and it makes the impression in the shape of the type that is then filled with hot lead. So the matrix is the mold for all the letters to follow. And CoC had never cut his own punches. So for Neuland, he decided that this would be the place where he would learn how to cut punches. And two really important things happened here was that, first of all, he was doing it so crudely that it didn't require as much skill to cut it as a more experienced punch cutter. So he was making things easy on himself by not following his drawings very carefully. He was just improvising when he was doing the type. And you can see that a lot of these shapes, the sharpness of the shape of the B is not like his calligraphy. This is his calligraphy in the lower left, where he was manipulating more round, but by changing the way he was making the letters, cutting the negative areas away, he was transforming the letter into its own characteristic that came from the cutting. So the other thing that he did not try and have each point size look the same as the other point sizes. So he was being very easy on what he was asking of his punch cutting skills while he was becoming familiar with cutting punches. But the big important thing that he did was he created a typeface which was the form of the letters came out of his expression. So it was the German expressionism typeface, both because they were using it in that kind of artwork, the posters of the day. In fact, I think, on this other page, here's the first example of this letter style. 15 years before Neuland was designed, Oskar Kokoschka put it in this poster. So it was the German expression letter style, and he took that same concept to the cutting of the type itself, the punches, by making it a very expressive typeface in its execution. So there was a revolution there too, in that he was making type into an art project, into a piece of art with its execution as well as its results. So I think it's just an amazing typeface, and it's really fun to try and capture the flavor that he created with a knife cutting away the negative areas when you're trying to do it as a positive calligraphic mark. So on page 79, there are a couple of examples done with a pen, and with these I was trying to capture the flavor of the typeface a little bit. And let me show you one last trick for the day here, and that is drawn terminals. Because he was cutting away the marks, and you can see in his calligraphy down here that an M is just 3 straight strokes. Where's my pen? With the strokes overlapping. Pretty straightforward. You can always do this when you're writing a Neuland style. But if we look at the typeface, remember, he was cutting away the negative areas to make this M, and look how the terminals at the top of this M, as well as the bottom of the V in the middle, are skinnier than the thickness of the stroke. So if you're trying to capture that flavor, we can make the main stroke and then draw the terminal. And when you're drawing the terminal, what that means is, that when you're making a mark, a straight calligraphic mark, you've drawn this part of the letter, right? But the pen itself made the terminal. So when we go in here and try and alter the way the terminal looks, we're drawing the shape of the terminal. So I'm turning the pen completely perpendicular to what that stroke was, and then making the thickness that I want out of that terminal. And then I can set the pen inside that and get, you know, a lesser thickness of stroke. Boy, that's ugly. But so that happens at the bottom of the W. Draw the terminal, and then you're ready to just swing up into the next part of the stroke. Draw the terminal that's going to accept this last stroke down inside that. The most crucial place for this is the capital E, because not only are we choosing our pen angle for the thickness of stroke, we're also doing it for the attitude of the terminal itself. So the most classic example of the E, and you can see they were all different, but the quintessential Neuland E is this one where it's going down to the right on the top end and down to the left on the bottom. So we can choose our pen angle to get a stroke that's a little skinnier than our vertical, that also ends with a bluntness going this way, and then the opposite angle for this one, right? No problem so far. But the terminal of the the middle stroke is really vertical. And if we choose that angle for that stroke, look what happens. That middle stroke is heavier than the other two horizontal strokes. And it has this ungainly look. It's actually a look that CoC used in other typefaces. But if we want to control it, and if any of you have seen Jackie Svaren's book where she talks about Neuland as a writing style, she will actually have you draw the terminal for all three of these strokes. But what we're going to do here is just be calligraphic with the top and bottom strokes, and then use the drawn terminal to have our vertical attitude, but a skinnier stroke. So the drawn terminals in a Neuland situation mean that you can control the thickness of the terminals to accept the other strokes that are following it. So Jackie Svaren's ductus in written letters has her doing this for all three strokes and then filling in. The T is done the same way in her book. Okay, so drawn terminals. Yes, question.
Is it me or I mean, this is like, I just love this page. When I look at it, I think the typeface has a more handmade feel to it in a sense. I think it's, but am I deceived, or?
Are you talking about the type page or my my calligraphy side?
I'm talking about the type page.
Yeah.
Where's that?
Well,
I think absolutely, it's amazing. It has kind of that block cut look in a sense.
Yeah.
To me.
It is. This is. Have you ever seen Nancy Levitt is somebody who does this a lot, but I've seen it from other people too, where they make eraser stamp alphabets out of Neuland. And so they're recreating CoC's experience with eraser stamps. And then they have their own little set of, she's done whole pages where she cut her own alphabet and then composed it with eraser stamps. It's a wonderful exercise, but there is something about these letters that are just changed. They're transformed when he changed from writing them with a pen to cutting the negative away with a knife. And there is something really appealing to me about this. I think it's just the most gorgeous thing ever.
I am totally taken with it. I think you see a lot of Neuland that's very round, where it's like the manipulation of the pen to achieve, like with the O, to achieve a perfectly round O or something. And I don't like that. I think this is gorgeous.
Carl?
And the other thing about it, Maura, is that that it's easier, that if you accept the fact that you can have a lumpy O, that means that, so we can overlap these strokes. But if the thing ends up being a little bit not so round or off balance or whatever, it's fine. It fits in with what the typeface does. So just like CoC was making life easier for himself when he cut without discipline, we can use that to write with a little less, carefulness. Is that the word I want? Caution. While we're doing this, and the funkiness is going to add to it. So it's liberating in all kinds of directions, both form and the way that they're created. I'm glad you feel that way, because I just love the cut look of this. And it's such an interesting challenge to see if you can capture that when you're writing it with a pen.
Yeah.
Carl,
That E
Yes.
again?
I also feel like in the E that you did, the center horizontal has a flared end.
Yes, and so that's again something that you can really control, Georgia, by the way you draw it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Exactly. So
that's what makes it so funky and fun.
yeah, and so this drawn terminal gives you so much freedom to reach things that can't just pop right out of the pen. Although there's another challenge that you could be taking here, and that is to, manipulate the pen to that kind of swelling as well. The thing is that you just can't get all the way to the vertical stroke without it ending up being fatter than these other horizontals. But there's a whole world of variations in your letters when you start to be able to control the thick strokes like this, as well as being able to draw the terminals. Lots of freedom. I'm going to show you several different things next week that use this as a starting point. So between the thick and thicker Unschel from the Menhart page to Neuland, there's a lot of relatively easy places to start getting the idea of how to work with monoline letters. Yeah, was there another question there? I thought I heard two people ask at once.
You answered it.
Okay, good.
Georgia kind of asked it and then you answered it, so we're good.
What about that inline part?
About the what?
The inline at the
The
bottom?
inline, I just put that there because I think it's such a beautiful thing. Undoubtedly how these letters were created is that he cut the silhouettes just like he did up here, and then came out and cut this middle. If you were going to try this calligraphically, I would suggest doing it with a brush rather than a pen, so that you have the drier gouache feeling rather than how ink is going to sort of be activated by any more wetness. So that if you did an inked version of the dark letter and then came back even with a brush for painting the inline inside, it's going to melt the ink a little bit. So this is one that I would say use gouache to start with and do the lettering, the solid letter, and then get a thin brush and do the inline. It's a big challenge.
Oopsie, whoa. What about a double prong?
I've never tried that, and I don't have a double up here. I'd have to go tear apart my studio to find that. But remember that the thing, you have one there. You're going to try it.
Do. Yep.
Okay, good.
I dropped it.
But the thing about a double prong pen is that it's going to leave the open part open, so that if you wanted it to look like the typeface, you're going to have to come in and sort of draw the edges of these things. Not to mention that the inline is not going to travel all the way through like this. So it would really be a challenge to make it work with a double a split pen like that. But again, what's going to happen? A different tool is going to bring you different restrictions and possibilities. So transformation is going to occur, so that if you started to say, I'm going to do a Neuland with a triple pen or a double pen or something, you would end up with a new letter style before you knew it. And that's a really good place to discover new stuff happening. And that is really in the spirit of this class, is anytime you change a variable, new possibilities happen. Whether it's trying to do a typeface that's been drawn with a calligraphy pen, something is going to change from those drawn letters to what you're writing. And that's where new stuff comes from. Maybe new typefaces.
Is it considered cheating to come back in with a white, like Jelly Roll pen?
Nothing is cheating. If you get the results you want, I was saying, that I was just thinking gouache with a brush, but I didn't think about a pen that's going to give you a light mark on top of a dark one. But whatever you got, by all means, do whatever you need to do to get your vision on the paper. It's terrific. What I was just noticing here is that the number 1 in the split, as well as a hint of it in the solid number 1, is that really horizontal wedge serif. And you can see the beauty of that it still has all that thickness, but it is much skinnier than the main stroke. So that's a little bit more reinforcement to the way I feel about wedge serifs. That the skinnier you can make them, exciting things happen. And you can also be extending the proportion of the letters to change that, and it starts to turn into a Latin style letter. Skinny wedge serifs, they're gorgeous. Okay. The one thing we haven't done yet, but I think what I'd like to do is give you this challenge for the week between now and our next session is, first of all, Sally asked, she thought that this would be great homework, is for you to go ahead and find any of the typefaces, any of the letter sources in here. Doesn't necessarily have to be a type. You might find some of these type designers' calligraphy that got thrown in as well, to see if you can interpret it. The thing about doing it with a typeface where it's really labeled that it's a type, that it had to have been drawn in the end, no matter how calligraphic it was to start with. So that means that when you start to write, you're going to be faced with some choices to decide, what do I have to do to make it look like the type? And do I care enough to do those things? Something is going to happen if you try to write it and not capture the drawn things that happen in the typeface. So just by doing it calligraphically and being true to your writing, it's going to change the way that letter is going to look from the typeface. So you get to choose however you want to approach any of the typefaces and see if you can do a piece that takes any kind of inspiration, flavor or shape, or any of the characteristics of the type into a modest calligraphic piece. And then the second challenge, and you only have to do one of them, you don't have to do any of them, this is all volunteer stuff, but just as another experiment, is to see if you can take a characteristic from 2 different typefaces and incorporate them into one letter style. And I love to mix, it's sort of like when I looked at the Czech Uncial and thought about Neuland, thickening up those strokes, that thick and thin Czech Uncial, what page was that? 62. That this letter was created from these letters, but also informed by Neuland as well, just in the way I was changing the proportions. So this is a case where this would be Neuland and the Czech Uncial. But there are so many different flavors and so many different things that can happen from the choices that you make, or any kind of characteristic from the typefaces that can give you new lettering. So if you want to be playing around with any of the stuff that we talked about, how you can interpret the type between now and next Saturday, we'd love to see that. And we'll have a little exhibition at the start of next week's class to see what you did. And then there's several more techniques and lots of talk about other typefaces that we've got for next week. You know, these 8 hours probably aren't enough, but so there'll be plenty to do.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If I'm going to be using some black paper and trying some different whites, so I've got
Yes,
these two, and then I've
I've
got
got that too.
these two.
Yeah, use the first two
You
with
like
the
both of
brush
those?
anyway. I hold them up again there. Yeah, Pam, the difference between these two, the Pro White doesn't have the chemical in it or whatever it is that makes the Dr. Martens bleed proof happen. And I've found that when I've used those, I don't use them so much with a pen, but they're great with a brush. I use them straight out of the jar. You can use a wet brush to the jar, use the edge of the jar as a palette. They both have terrific action in the brush. I like them both. They're very opaque, wonderful stuff. But the thing about the Pro White is that whatever they put in it to make it stop the bleed from underneath makes it more crystalline, and it starts to build up on the edge of your jar. That's the only drawback to the Dr. Martens. But the Pro White is really just a jar of really good quality white gouache, and it works straight through. I always just buy the Pro White these days. And the other thing that I like about Pro White is that, let's say you've used ink for one, I remember a piece I did where I did Neuland style letters in ink, and then in between the lines, I used the Pro White and let it overlap those strokes, and wherever it crossed over the ink, the stroke ink, even though the ink was dry, it would bleed up through the white and tint the white. That's because the Dr. Martens bleed proof wouldn't let that happen. But when it does happen, it sort of made a checkerboard out of my white letters. And so that was really a fun thing as well. But both of them they have that brush quality, whereas those second ones you held up are a little more like ink, and I find them more runny. I like a dry brush texture to the gouache when I'm writing.
I have a question. I forget, I haven't used my Pentel brushes in a while. Can you fill these with ink?
I never bother. Honest, more the thing I found once, I've been using this, one of my favorite flavors of ink here is sepia calligraphy. And I've been dipping brushes into sepia calligraphy ink for a long, long time and getting the kind of writing that I want out of it. And one time I tried to suck the sepia ink up into an empty handle, you know, the reservoir of those Pentel color brushes, so I could send it through the color brush. And it changed the texture of the ink. And I can't explain that, but it just didn't feel right. It was too wet, it was too strange. And so now if I have an empty one, I just use it as a dip brush. Same thing as those water brushes. You can just dip it into ink. It's really not worth the hassle of trying to get the ink in those things. Although that being said, I do like the ink that comes with them.
Yeah.
And I buy the refills. I bought, I buy them by the box. I've got a couple boxes of brown.
That's what I couldn't remember.
Yeah. And you just you unscrew the handle. The whole handle is the what's replaced when you replace those things. Like everything, they're changing what's available. And I don't know that refills are that easily got for these color brushes anymore. So you know what I do? I buy new ones and of the colors that I like, and then take those handles off and put empty handles on the new brush so that I have a clean dip one rather than, starting with, say if I've got this brown one and once it goes empty, then I'm going to use it as a dip. If I'm going to put it in white gouache, it's going to be beige for, a long time. So I just start with a clean one of these. I buy a new brown so that I've got a new brown refill for the ones that I am sending the ink through. And then I've got a clean brush that I can dip into gouache, and it's easier to keep clean. So I never throw out these handles because I know that that's going to be the handle for a nice, clean, new color brush one of these days that I can use as a dip brush.
Okay.
Okay.
Did they,
All right.
did
So
they made the refills?
what's that?
Have they always made the replacements?
Yeah, they used to. I'm thinking you'd have a hard time getting refills now. If you go on, the last time I looked on Amazon or at Paper and Ink, you can easily get the yellow refills and the peach colored refills because nobody wants those things. But try and find a brown one these days. It's impossible. And the funny thing about these things, the ink is different. The different colors have different consistency. I was thrilled when they came out with the olive colored Pentel color brushes back in the early 2000s or late 90s or something. And I got an olive and the action of the ink was different than what I liked. Big disappointment. So for me, I just get brown and red and black. And the thing about black is that black ink is gummier than the colors, but the colors are not light fast. So if you did a red piece with a Pentel color brush and put it on a wall, it would be a pink piece in just 6 months.
Yeah.
In a sunny room. So really, if you want to do something with a Pentel color brush that you're going to give to a friend and hope she puts it on her wall, you should be dipping that in a permanence A gouache, and because no ink is really light fast.
Right.
Hey, Carl, did you want to discuss how people can submit stuff for comment during the week?
Yes, I was just going to say that.
Okay,
that
great.
This week I'd be happy to help you during the week. So if you can just take a digital picture and email me the picture, then we can talk about it on the phone. I don't know how to set up a Zoom meeting, so it's not like I could do a demonstration for you, but I think we can talk through it. And it would be much easier for me to talk to you on the phone than to try and type a reply to you. So email me first, and if I have some sort of demonstration that I want you to see, I'll do it beforehand, and then I'll email that back to you, and then we'll talk about it on the phone. So let me give you my phone number and my email address.
And you can also include your own phone numbers in your email,
Right.
So then you guys can,
Yeah, in fact, why don't you just email me first, and then we'll set up a time to talk via email. So it's Sally, you're on my screen. Are you guys seeing this big? It's roars@baymoon.com. Can you see that? It's roars, ROHRS, @baymoon.com. I had that for a long time before I realized that my email address had me howling at the moon. There you go.
Yeah, can you guys see that okay? ROHRS@baymoon.com. Don't do the big L in there.
Yeah, the L is not part of it. And if you lose that or it bounces back, you can get it from Sally for sure.
Yep.
Okay, so I'd be happy to help you this week. Go ahead and send me the picture first of what your question is, or where your practice is, and I'll be glad to help you. Because this 4 hours went by way too fast, and same thing's going to happen next week. So let's. I always find that the best stuff happens in workshops when I go around and sit with you individually and really react to what you're doing to see what happens. So that this is the big frustration for me about Zoom classes, is that I can't look over your shoulder and see what you're doing and all that stuff. So let's try and make up for that with sessions during the week if you'd like. Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Okay, great.
And then I will send, or I or Georgia will send you guys the link to the recording. So you'll be able to access that during the week too. It'll take I probably won't get up till this evening. It'll take a couple hours to format and then to upload, but look for an email with the link to that.
Okay.
Sounds
All right.
good.
Well, that was fun.
Oh,
Great.
it
Thank you
was
so much.
so much fun.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
All right. Have a great
everybody.
week, but I'll talk to you before then, I hope.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Carl.
Carl.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
You all have a good week.